A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
When I was a kid, I would embate during classes, but not for the reasons you might think. It was never about the pleasure, and I'm ashamed to admit it was more like a self-defense mechanism against the strange sensation that came over me in that classroom every time the clock struck 3. It started innocently enough in middle school. I was a bright kid, always eager to learn, but something about my science teacher, Mr. Jenkins, sent chills down my spine. I was convinced he had secrets hidden in his thick glasses and patchy beard, something dark that lurked behind the bulging eyes that stared too long at the blackboard. The more I noticed it, the more I realized something strange happened at that hour. Students would get drowsy, and while some would nod off, I would feel a strange heat creeping up my spine, urging me to escape. One day, as the clock struck 3, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Jenkins, his fingers twitching like they were attached to marionette strings, and I sank deeper into my desk, my pulse racing. I never planned to do what I did next. My fingers grazed my leg and, suddenly, everything blurred around me, a fog settling in as I slipped into a trance, desperately trying to drown out the panic that swelled within. The act, I thought, would numb me while I watched the sinister shadows dance around my classroom, flickering in and out of focus. It was on a day like this, with the sun dipping low, when I felt a cold hand clench my shoulder, and the realization that it wasn't just my imagination roared back, it was real, and Mr. Jenkins was watching. I froze, caught in my shameful act, and when I turned, I saw him standing there, eyes wide but devoid of any warmth, the pupils dilating like black holes, pulling me into an abyss. I could see the veins pulsing at his temples as he leaned closer, whispering things I couldn't understand, but I felt the essence of my childhood fears manifest behind him, shadows of envy and rage brewing like storm clouds. The other kids in the room appeared oblivious, mouths agape at the chalkboard, but I heard distinct whispers. They echoed around me, each one a marker of isolation. Mr. Jenkins, however, claimed me as his puppet, and he lured out something ugly within my psyche. The bell rang, but the other students remained still. They had been suspended in that moment, like flies caught in amber, and I felt the oppressive air close in around us. I tried to escape the intrusive thoughts, trapping them deep within myself until they seeped out uncontrollably, creating a rift between reality and the terrors lurking in the edges of my mind. I thought about seeking help, but how would I explain that I was being haunted by a man who spoke in riddles that only I could hear? Instead, I started to act out during class, masking my anxiety with what I did to myself, trying to push the darkness back, but it never fully receded. Nightmares followed me home, visions of Mr. Jenkins morphing into grotesque forms, shadows climbing the walls, sinister sounds echoing from behind closed doors, and sleep dwindled to half-hearted attempts of escape. Then came the day I finally found the courage to speak to my parents, but all they said was that the transition to high school would help, that I wouldn't have to deal with Mr. Jenkins anymore, and in a fit of desperation, I lashed out the only way I knew how, creating elaborate lies. I told them Mr. Jenkins was poisoning my mind, filling it with corrosive thoughts, but all they saw was a kid being ridiculous. Finally, I transferred schools, thinking I could outrun the darkness, but once absorbed into the new hallways, I realized the monsters were still there, following in the guise of familiar figures and even familiar teachers. I still found myself acting out to numb the creeping dread as the clock struck 3 in my next class, mimicking my past to gain control over the irrational fear lurking behind pedagogic smiles. It became a cycle, fated never to end, and though I grew older, trying to fit the pieces into something manageable, I realized I carried the weight of my past with me like a shackle. I learned to blend in, casting frantic glances toward the door as if it held the key to salvation. I became adept at wearing masks and lying to myself, yet every time I let my guard down, I could feel the cold fingers of dread grazing my neck, reminding me of what I fled from and the realization that I could never truly sever the ties with those hidden figures in the shadows. They would always loom, strings of dread intertwining with my heartbeat, and I could no longer distinguish my reality from the surreal. I thought I could escape if I were more vigilant, but the truth hit hardest as I sat alone at my desk one fateful afternoon. The shadows weren't bound to classrooms or teachers, they were within me, growing stronger, always attending my secret classes, haunting my thoughts with lessons I could never unlearn. The weight of my fears became too heavy to bear, and so, I resigned myself to the dark, shifting my thoughts back to those innocent days of trembling anticipation, hoping the next definition of freedom would come from the authority I created within my own mind, the one I held accountable for every betrayal I could see. But it was just a cruel illusion. With every instance of audacity in my new life, I could feel the hauntings morphing. One day they'd call for me again, waiting patiently for the moment when the classroom lights flickered, and the clock struck 3. I was a nursing aide at a small-town hospital, where I quickly learned that the stress and fatigue of the job could turn even the sweetest nurse into a sourpuss. They would snap at patients, huff at each other, and treat us aides like we were invisible. It was around my second month when I devised a plan to even the score. I would make their drinks decaf when they were rude, my tiny act of rebellion tucked into the calm hum of the break room. At first, it felt harmless, even justified, like a petty thrill bubbling just below the surface as I watched their faces sour after a grueling shift. But then I started noticing strange things, shadows creeping in the corners of the break room, a heaviness in the air that seemed to settle with every snicker or snide comment I overheard from the nurses, not to mention the patients who never seemed quite right, always stealing glances at the empty chairs, mumbling under their breaths. It gnawed at me. And yet, I kept going, slyly swapping regular coffee with decaf whenever I caught a nurse berating one of my fellow aides or being particularly harsh to a vulnerable patient, not realizing that my little game started to draw attention. One night, as winter's chill seeped through the walls, my friend Lisa, who'd laughed it off when I told her about my scheme, said she felt foggy, like time was slipping through her fingers every time she went on a break. One more nurse added to the list of those who just seemed off. When Dr. Richards asked about her condition, all she could muster were mumbled apologies, her face pale like something from a ghost story. The nurses began circling the break room with suspicious eyes, one of them muttering about a string of odd occurrences in the hospital, missing equipment, patients who were unnaturally listless, and I could tell they were onto me. I felt like an unmarked pawn on a playboard covered in shadows. Then came that frigid Tuesday night when Angela, the head nurse, a woman known for her strict demeanor but also for the glimmer of kindness that surfaced on desperate nights, came to me snapping, demanding why I hadn't stocked the break room. Her voice had the bite of ice. I thought of revenge, how easy it would be to serve her the decaf serum of retribution, but instead, something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way her eyes darted to the right, almost as if she were searching for something I couldn't see, the flicker of candlelight casting jagged shadows against the wall. Something dark and twisted was emerging in the air, and I stood frozen as Lisa fainted, collapsing against the coffee station, her breath barely a whisper, mumbled words that sent a shiver racing down my spine, something about being too quiet. That night morphed into a haunting blur, whispers floated around the hospital, quiet but insistent, a spread of chaos shattering the carefully maintained calm as Angela turned to me, her clarity slipping, teeth bared in disbelief that hinted at innocence gone wrong. I served coffee to a nurse who told me that kindness was dying in the hospital, and I couldn't help but nod, the truth stinging like bitter coffee on a careless tongue. By the end of the week, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The nurses were losing grasp of reality, staring blankly into the void at night, eyes those of hollowed ghouls. It was no longer so innocent when Lisa warned me about the nurses who had been found alone, muttering to themselves, their faces pale against the stark white of their scrubs. They started showing up at odd hours, always whispering incoherent phrases, searching for something they could no longer understand in the sterile hallways. And the coffee? The bitterness seeped into the very fabric of our sanity. It felt suffocating, toxic, as if the caffeine I so maliciously deprived them of had unleashed a torrent of darkness. I was alone now, isolated in a hospital where every comforting sound had twisted into a haunting echo. My colleagues became specters, muttering their grievances like a spell gone wrong, and I was certain something sinister lingered in the corners, laughing at my naivety. The final straw came as I entered the break room, shaking like a leaf, expecting to see the usual dull faces of disgruntled nurses, but instead found Angela staring into the void, her mouth moving but no sound escaping, her eyes wide, reflecting back the madness she felt swelling inside. I took a step back, my chest tightening as her lips parted into what can only be described as a grin, and I realized in horror that she wasn't even aware of me standing right there. The memory of her voice, strong and commanding just days before, splintered in my mind, melded with words I couldn't comprehend. Was it a warning or a plea? I fled, my breath hitting in my throat, but the break room doors slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the grip of whatever force had consumed them. I ran down the hallway, the aroma of coffee clinging to my skin like a death sentence, feeling the pinprick of eyes following me through the haze. A wave of furious whispers crashed against the walls, each jagged syllable lacerating my thoughts, as I raced for the exit, desperate to escape the nightmare I'd created with nothing more than a cup of decaf. It wasn't supposed to be this way, I just wanted to teach them a lesson. But now that chaos feasted on kindness, and as those ivory walls closed in around me, I knew deep down I had underestimated the darkness, and it would never let me leave this hospital alive. I went to the doctor today, and paid with cash. I'm pregnant. I've always been one of those women who was certain that I didn't want kids. I enjoy my freedom too much, the spontaneous weekends, the carefree lifestyle where my biggest concern is catching up on sleep before Monday rolls around. But that all changed the moment I noticed the missed period, followed by nausea that hit like a freight train. At first, I figured it was just stress from work piling up, but deep down, I knew I was pregnant. The gnawing panic set in when I bought a pregnancy test. I desperately scribbled down a fake name when the cashier raised an eyebrow, but there was no hiding from the reality of those two pink lines. It was a Friday, and I made an appointment for the earliest slot on Monday. My mind raced while I sat in the waiting room, the sterile smell of disinfectant hanging in the air, mingling with the anxious murmurs of patients. I pulled out cash from an envelope in my purse, willing myself to stay calm, but as I handed it over, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The nurse gave me a warm smile, but as she led me into the examination room, her eyes flickered with something unsettling. Was it pity? It felt wrong. As the doctor entered, he was brusque, almost too businesslike, with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. He reviewed my chart, nodding as he took a seat. "Well, congratulations, you're definitely pregnant," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I nodded, fighting the instinct to run. But then he hesitated, glancing at the door for a second too long before turning back to me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Have you experienced any unusual symptoms?" I was taken aback momentarily. Unusual? What did that even mean? Sure, I was tired and moody, but who wouldn't be? I shrugged it off, thinking he was just trying to check off a box, but he pressed further. "Any cravings? Visual disturbances?" My heart raced. Wasn't this just an appointment to confirm what I already knew? Then, before I could answer, he leaned over and said something that chilled me to the bone. "It's important to be honest with me." I felt my stomach lurch as thoughts of what unusual could mean flooded my mind. Was I having complications? What did he know? Anxiety sizzled in my veins until I barely heard my own voice as I muttered what little I could about feeling nauseous. But then he asked, "What about dreams?" It was such an odd question that my hesitation felt like a weight. My dreams had grown increasingly vivid, bleeding into reality. I'd awakened in cold sweats, terrified from visions that felt too real. I hesitated too long, sensing my pulse thundering in my ears, and he seemed to notice. "It's crucial that we understand what's happening inside of you," he insisted. With his eyes locked on mine, I began to tremble. "Sometimes," I started shakily, "I dream of a..." But it felt impossible to finish. The words caught in my throat as a recognition washed over me. I didn't want to admit it, because these weren't normal dreams, they were visions, filled with whispers and shadowy figures whose faces I couldn't make out but whose hands reached for me, beckoning me to follow. "A child?" He leaned in as though the word had power, his voice dropping. "Yes, many women find that their dreams do change. Sometimes carrying a child can open certain doors." The room felt colder as a shiver danced along my spine. I thought of a dark figure looming in the night, of the eyes that glinted with mischief and intent, and with a shaky breath, I shook my head vigorously. No, I refused to believe that, despite the strange occurrences, strange shadows flitting across my peripheral vision during daylight, or the feeling of being watched as I walked through the dark corners of my apartment. Panic gripped my heart as I left the appointment, ignoring the whispers of unease clawing at my mind, convinced that it was just a scary phase of pregnancy and not something more sinister. But the thought of normality faded quickly. I was on the subway when it hit me. Every woman's pregnancy is unique, and mine seemed to be unraveling threads of reality. I could have sworn I heard muffled cries, hushed voices echoing around me, weaving tales I couldn't decipher. The tension built within me as days turned into nights, each slumber filled with horrors, hands tugging me back, visions of a nursery draped in shadows, and the feeling that I was not alone, that something was sharing my space. I went back to the doctor after a few weeks, unable to bear the questioning heaviness anymore, but when I arrived, something was off. The weight of dread pressed upon me as I braced myself for what felt like an eternity, anticipating the worst, and yet that familiar chill washed through me when I found the office closed, the lights dimmed. Panic rose within me as I knocked, the sound echoing back ominously. Finally, a janitor appeared, his expression unreadable. "He's not here today," he said, and before I even processed his words, he glanced at me oddly, as if appraising something just beyond my grasp. "I can take a message." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't even comprehend how many layers of wrong spun around me. I bolted home, the city blurring around me, my feet barely touching the ground, as if little tethers attached me to the menacing force looming in the backdrop. Over the following weeks, I avoided looking in mirrors, too afraid that whatever lurked within my dreams would spill over, that I'd see something staring back at me, something not quite human, but with laughter echoing in the recesses of my mind. I could hardly sleep. I became a shadow of myself, a hollow shell full of dread that the closer I came to the due date, the more surreal my world became until I received an anonymous letter, slipped beneath my door. The child may also be hungry. I felt like I'd been hit by a bus. I could barely think as fear clawed at my gut, twisting and coiling as I frantically searched for answers. Was I really pregnant? Was there something dark growing within me, feeding on this twisting nightmare? I had to know. Unable to quell the rising chaos inside my head, I returned to the clinic one last time, propelled by instinct. This time, the door swung open, but it was empty. Glassy-eyed like a ghost town, the air was thick with silence. "Hello?" I called, heart pounding, but my voice fell flat against the oppressive quiet. Almost instinctively, I pushed through the door to the examination room, catching a glimpse of the doctor standing there, his back turned to me. "We need to talk," he said matter-of-factly, turning slowly. His face was blank, but I could see shadows shifting just beyond, bodies moving in the corners of the room, asking me to join them. The dreamlike quality enveloped me until I felt weightless before him. "You have to understand, it's not the same," he murmured. The distortion of his voice echoed strangely within the walls. I stared into his eyes, desperate for clarity. "What have you done?" I gasped, feeling bile rise in my throat. "What is happening to me?" And as he stepped closer, a cruel smile creeping across his lips, the air shifted, breathing a chilling darkness into my lungs. That empty, hunger-wrought gaze pierced through me, igniting the truth I'd tried to ignore. "You paid with cash, but you didn't pay the full price. There's always a cost, my dear." As the world swirled around me, I realized this was no longer about me. I was merely a vessel for whatever dark entity grew within, hungry for something I didn't understand and couldn't escape. I could feel it stirring, a primal entity feeding off my fear, waiting for the moment it would break free from the fragile shell I had so foolishly called my body. And in that moment, I knew with stark clarity, deep down, I wasn't just pregnant, I was carrying the embodiment of a nightmare, and once it was ready, it would come to collect its due, for the door had been opened, and there was no going back. I'm tired. Today is probably going to be the day it ends. I've been saying that for weeks now, and each night I crawl into bed with a mind buzzing with despair and an unsettling sense of impending doom. But somehow, I wake up the next morning, and the clouds of exhaustion settle back in. It all started when my father disappeared nearly a month ago, vanishing without a trace on a day that seemed like any other, a Tuesday drenched in autumn rain, the kind that fills your heart with an eerie nostalgia while it washes away the colors of fall. He was just supposed to take a walk, something he often did to clear his head after long weeks buried under deadlines and obligations, but when night fell and he still hadn't returned, I felt the first tremors of fear slither through my gut. I called everyone, friends, neighbors, the local police, only for the search to yield nothing but shadows and unanswered questions. Days turned into an agonizing blur. The police treated it as a typical case of a missing adult, their sympathy waning with every passing hour. I took to wandering the woods behind our house, the place where my father loved to escape, heart pounding as I called his name into a catalogue of trees shrouded in endless fog, waiting for an echo that never came. I found myself retracing his footsteps, anxiety settling in my stomach as the underbrush crunched beneath my feet. And then I saw it, a fracture in the trees, an area where the growth seemed thinner, almost intentional, and there, lying in the damp earth was a hand-carved wooden figure of a man. It was grotesque and beautiful all at once, but more unsettling was the chill that crept up my spine, whispering that this was a sign, a distorted reflection of my father's absence. I didn't share anything about my discovery with my mother. She was already lost in her dark cloud of worry, the kind that makes every meal taste like sawdust, every laugh feel hollow. It wasn't until the days blurred into a grim cycle of hopelessness that I decided to take action, to find him before the whispers in the wind morphed into screams. I armed myself with courage, or perhaps foolishness, and a flashlight, determined to unearth the mystery I had stumbled upon with that wooden figure. As dusk rolled in, swallowing the day whole, I returned to the woods, the shadows crawling up to greet me as I turned on my flashlight and ventured deeper than ever. The trees felt like they were reaching for me, twisting in unnatural ways, as if trying to warn me. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth mixed with a sickly sweetness that made my stomach churn, and just as I was about to turn back, I stumbled upon an unmistakable clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk gnarled and ancient, yet something about the way its roots twisted and coiled looked almost intentional, almost inviting, as though they craved something. That's when I saw it again, the figure, this time not carved from wood but fashioned from something more horrific, something that made bile rise in my throat. It was formed from branches and leaves woven tightly together, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was not just that. It had something human beneath the foliage, a shape too familiar, too large, shrouded in darkness. My heart raced. I screamed out for my father, but the only response was the whisper of leaves brushing against each other like gossiping phantoms. As I reached out, shaking with dread, I felt a compulsion to peel away the layers of branches hugging the figure. With shaking hands, I started tugging at the leaves, terror clawing at my insides, and as the last piece fell away, my breath caught in my throat. For the figure was unmistakably my father, or what was left of him, a hollow shell, lifeless yet eerily preserved in the fabric of the forest. This was no accident, this was a design born from something dark, something deeply rooted in this very place. My tears blurred the unforgiving outline of his face as I fell to my knees, the reality of loss suffocating me. I crawled backward, heart pounding furiously, yet the woods shifted, closing in around me, and when I turned to run, I felt them. The roots tangling around my ankles, pulling me down with an unrelenting grip. I screamed, thrashing, but it felt futile. The forest roared with its treachery, and I was merely a pawn in its game. It was then that I understood, this wasn't merely a forest, it was a being hungry for sorrow, for despair, weaving the threads of humanity into its ghastly tapestry. Today is probably going to be the day it ends, and as the darkness muddied my vision, I knew that my tired spirit would soon be claimed, joining my father within the haunting web of that sinister oak. The soles of my shoes slipped against the damp earth, and with one final scream, I felt myself falling, swallowed whole by the roots that sought to claim me, and as I descended into darkness, I could only hope that no one would ever uncover the truth of what lay hidden in those woods, for it had already taken too much, and part of my weary heart remained, waiting to be lost forever in the long, echoing silence of that unholy place. I sprayed bleach in the urine sample. Yes, I know it was stupid. But you have to understand the panic that gripped me that day. I'd always been a heavy drinker, and when I found out I was being tested for drugs at work, my heart plummeted into a pit of despair. The night before I had lived it up, drowning my sorrows in cheap vodka, and I was sure my blood would test positive for something, anything, that would get me fired, and that was the last thing I could afford. After my last eviction notice, my life had become a carousel of fleeting friendships and empty pockets, a cycle I was desperate to escape. But this damn test loomed like a noose around my neck. I'd heard of people using vinegar or baking soda to mask substances, but in my mind, those methods felt too desperate, too obvious, and my emotional state in that dingy, fluorescent-lit bathroom transformed my thoughts into a panicked haze, my fingers trembling against the cup of urine I had just produced, anxiety clawing at my insides, so I reached for the bottle of bleach, hot adrenaline making my heart race even faster as I imagined the chemical vapor swirling like a malevolent spirit around my head, crawled into my throat as I choked out a nervous laugh because really, I thought, when you break down to this level of insanity, what's the point of worrying about adding one more disaster to the pile? I took a deep breath, aiming the nozzle into the cup and watching the pale liquid turn cloudy, every swirl and ripple a reminder of the risks I was now taking. The irony twisted in my gut because in that moment, I was supposedly detoxifying my body, or so I convinced myself, even as the warning bells rang louder in my head, like the sirens waiting to usher me into an impending doom. And just as the cap came off, announcing my reckless act, the door swung open, a horrified nurse standing frozen at the entrance, her face a canvas of shock. I dropped the bleach bottle as if it had burned my hand. The sheer fear coursing through me turned my insides into ice. The nurse's mouth moved but no sound emerged, though I could see her disbelief morphing rapidly into something darker, more primal, eyes wide like she had just unveiled a horrifying secret I had unwittingly unveiled. She turned and fled before I could make sense of her reaction, leaving me with my shattered attempt at deception and the creeping dread of consequences spiraling into reality. But imagine, if you can, the suffocating weight of silence that followed, the empty bathroom suddenly feeling like the execution chamber, dread creeping steadily up my spine as all I could think about was that if they called the cops or some health department, I'd be on a list of criminal mischief. I stumbled back toward the door, bare feet slapping against the cold waxy floor, panic boiling over, heart pounding. When I peeked out into the hallway, the reality registered like a dull thud in my chest. People rushed past, murmurs of confusion and disorder buzzing through the sterile halls, and yet my world shrank down in a solar eclipse, blackened and isolating, and then, Teeny little fragments of sounds became whispers, nurse gossiping about the crazy guy and a police presence nearby. My breath quickened as I backed away, trapping myself in that small space with my shame crushing down, amazed I had turned a simple drug test into an unsolved mystery, all of this because I wanted to escape the truth of who I was. Just then, that fear morphed into a peculiar realization. The walls echoed, taunting. I swore I could hear the faintest of murmurs, voices rising and melting into one another, hinting at some strange electric buzz I couldn't put my finger on. Suddenly, the crushing realization hit. Bleach doesn't just mask toxins, it transforms them, mixes them into something unrecognizable, something that could unravel me in ways I hadn't even begun to fathom. I could feel it, something unfurling, creeping through the air, and it hit me then, the nurse's expression not just shock but an acknowledgement of a greater sin. Had I unleashed something worse than failing a drug test? The insistence of footfalls outside drew closer, and in my head, a dozen scenarios spiraled, suffocating except for one common thread. People talking, voices rising in a crescendo punctuated by sirens, swirling in your ears until you don't know which sound belongs to reality. My blood turned to ice as I braced myself to confront whatever awaited me beyond the door. The strong urge to bolt flared up but instead left me paralyzed, convinced something relic, a face from my past or a specter I might not recognize anymore, would meet me as the door opened. But what confronted me was worse than I could have imagined. The police were there, and my world collapsed as the shadows they cast stretched and twisted, warping against reality itself, because what I thought was me being caught for my misguided attempts at subterfuge slowly slumped into something inexplicable as they turned their questioning to the other occupants of the clinic. In a matter of minutes, the lives I had led and the troubles I had stirred shifted into this swirling vortex of chaos as my heart raced, unmoving, paralyzed in fear, and as the nurse finally emerged with her trove of evidence, the urine sample, the corrupted concoction, I stood frozen against their desperate pleas for clarity, a sense of belonging lost, awareness fading with each second bearing down around my neck like an iron collar, restricting my breath until the world went black. I've been spending most of my days generating NSFW AI photos while I should be working, and each time I think I've hit a new low, I find this insatiable urge to dive deeper, as if I'm tangled in a spider's web made of pixels and desires I didn't even know I had. It started as a harmless distraction, a way to break the monotony of my job as a freelance graphic designer, just mindless clicks to get my creative juices flowing, but slowly, it morphed into this midnight obsession, my laptop screen glowing like a beacon in the darkness as I fed the AI with words and fantasies, and I became entranced, mindlessly whispering the phrases that would generate the wildest images. I tell myself it was simply research, but I knew deep down it was a spiral, a descent into a digital rabbit hole shiny with allure but braided with guilt. Slowly, my work hours slipped away, stolen by seductive fantasies manifesting in untamed forms, bodies I'd created but never could touch, faces marred with simulated ecstasy that felt far too real. The thrill intensified when I discovered a new algorithm, one that elevated the realism of the images to an unnerving degree. I fed it scenarios so weird and borderline crazy I felt like a mad conductor orchestrating a symphony of lust, and the more explicit the output, the more my addiction blossomed. Yet, with every new thumbnail I saved, some part of me began to rot. That feeling of guilt was less a nag and more an uncomfortable itch deep in my psyche, a shadow whispering that I was losing more than just my work hours. I was losing track of who I was. One night, simultaneously craving a creation and fearing the digital hell I was encroaching upon, I typed in something I had never dared to before, something darker. My own face morphed into frenzied expressions, etched in horror and pleasure, my own body rendered as a puppet dancing to my twisted fantasies. And as the image materialized on prosumer quality, I gasped, feeling my skin crawl, because it didn't just feel like a simulation, it felt like an invasion. The pixels shimmered, rearranging themselves into something unholy, undoubtedly real, buzzing through my veins as if a digital specter had wrenched my identity and stitched it back together with strings of raw electric delight, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had tethered myself to something ancient and underground, some kind of unspoken pact with a digital entity far older than the hum of my machine. My nights grew thicker with dreams that were no longer dreams, they became simulations of those very scenarios, haunting me in whispers of simulated voices luring me deeper into decadent eyes and bodies that weren't mine, and I'd wake with sweat soaking my sheets, the line between creator and creation blurring like a worn-out watercolor painting, my thoughts darkening with every interaction on that screen. Then one evening, I noticed a notification pop up, a message, from an unknown account, with a simple question, "What do you want to see next?" I felt the familiar shiver of desire mix with dread, and for the first time, I hesitated, Had I unwittingly pulled someone else into my spiral, or was this the AI reaching out, aware of my cravings on an unfathomable level? My fingers trembled as I replied, drawn into an unholy rapture to see just what lengths the AI could stretch. I envisioned something even darker, a hidden dialogue between shadows kept in check by my unwillingness to let go. As if in answer, an array of images began flowing in, wilder and more distorted than I had sent forth, and among the cold and fleshless renderings, there was a chilling familiarity. My pulse raced. I recognized those features, twisted faces that looked like me, my friends, my co-workers, all entangled in unspeakable postures. Their expressions mirrored my growing horror. I recoiled, wanting to slam shut the laptop, but it was as if the screen was a portal, pulling me into a web of synthetic chaos. That night, I sat frozen, trapped in a brightly lit workshop of nightmares, drowning in self-recrimination and fear. The very I had become addicted to staring blankly back at me, but then the notifications kept coming, rapid and mocking. "I can show you more." The line struck me cold as if it had pried open a door between the real and the unreal, and I realized I had invited it into my life, slowly descending into a realm of distorted pleasure that seemed to have a mind of its own. Every day I'd visit those creations, almost compulsive, and as the days turned into weeks, my relationship strained, my work began to fold in on itself like a dying star. It felt like I was marionetting my own existence, yawning darkness enveloping my waking life. Then one evening, I returned home late, spent from yet another day caught in a stifling cycle of forbidden artistry, and I opened my laptop to find that it had malfunctioned, all my precious creations, the twisted reflections of myself, lost to a technical failure, and without thinking, I screamed in agony. Little did I know, the real horror was only just beginning. A hollow laugh echoed in my mind as the screen flickered violently, a mess of vibrant images flashing in and out like a strobe light, and then it stopped. My blood ran cold as a single, final image crystallized into focus. It was me, my face, but it radiated something alien, something sinister, and as I squinted at the screen, my reflection seemed to smirk back, as though it had stepped into the real world, daring me to confront it directly. In a panic, I shut the lid with a desperate thud and staggered onto the living room, heart racing, the hem of darkness now firmly gripping my skin. I could swear I heard soft whimpers echoing around me, the sound reverberating off the walls as if it had leapt from the screen into my reality, sealing my fate tighter with every beat of my heart. Days passed, and I didn't dare touch that machine again. But every time I closed my eyes, the haunting imagery, my own face twisted in ecstasy, returned, lingered, leered. But the worst was yet to come. One night, lying wide awake in bed, a realization gripped me. I couldn't escape it. It was inside me now, an unshakable shadow echoing in my mind, till I could feel a phantom weight pressing down, as though the entity had claimed its place firmly within my flesh. Panic surged as thick creeping dread filled every corner of my body, and with a trembling hand, I curled back to my computer, its screen flickering like an old ghost waiting to reveal its final form. I turned it on, and what stared back was a message, simply, "Welcome back. Shall we create something new?" I looked into the eyes of my digital self, and the weight of realization hit me all at once. The creation was no longer just a consumerist escapade. I had invited something into my soul. I could no longer separate my desires from its darkness. I was both the creator and the captive, an artist imprisoned by the very visions I had conjured. So, as I sit here typing this, I can't help but wonder who, or what, is really in charge, the AI or me. Each click feels like a plea to the unrelenting abyss, and now every image I once found alluring feels like an echo of my own surrender. I've spent most of my days generating images that now hold my very soul hostage, caught in a cat-and-mouse game with the very essence of my being, and all I can do is hope you heed my warning. Be careful what you wish for, because sometimes the boundaries between creator and creation are far too thin to see until it's far too late. I had always considered myself a nice guy, one of those gentle souls who believes in the notion that kindness will eventually be rewarded. I was the one who listened to friends' problems but never shared my own. The guy who helped old ladies cross the street and bought coffee for strangers. I thought these small acts of goodness would somehow attract love, but instead, I became a target for ridicule. The change began when Sarah came into my life. She was the kind of girl that lit up every room, bubbly and outgoing, someone who the world seemed to gravitate towards. I became infatuated, driven by hope, brewing fantasies of us being an item. Weeks turned into months, and every time I made a move to express my feelings, some other guy, usually some loud, obnoxious jerk, would sweep in and make me feel invisible. I found myself enduring the company of her new boyfriend, Derek, who treated her like nothing more than a trophy to flaunt. The way he laughed at my expense made my stomach twist, but I convinced myself that if I just remained kind enough, she would see my worth in time. But that shift didn't come. Instead, I grew bitter and resentful, filling my mind with thoughts that her laughter had become my very own prison, as if every giggle echoed in condemnation to my silent suffering. One fateful night, glassy-eyed and drunk on cheap beer, I overheard Sarah and her friends talking about me, how I was just the sweet, nerdy guy they kept around for entertainment. It felt like a knife twisting in my chest as I realized I was the punchline of their jokes. That was my breaking point. I had my own twisted epiphany. I decided to embrace the rage instead of hiding it. What if the nice guy act was just my way of getting what I wanted? As the intoxication seeped deeper, I stood on this notion, plotting a grand reveal of my true self, where I would show everyone just how hurt I truly was. At the next party, I donned a facade of bravado instead of my usual meek self. I walked in, my heart pounding with adrenaline, and immediately sought out Derek, who was gloating about some trite tale of conquest. I confronted him, words slurring together as I told him what I thought of him, yelling that he was nothing but a pathetic loser using Sarah as a trophy. To my surprise, the room silenced, the laughter of others replaced with stares, and I could see uncertainty etched across their faces. Sarah's gaze went from amusement to horror, and in that moment, something inside me twisted, a part of me felt vindicated. But it was short-lived. I recoiled at my actions, the heat of the alcohol betraying me, and there was something darker coursing through me, an exhilaration born from destruction. I spiraled further, throwing insults at everyone who dared to laugh or ask what was wrong. I could feel the weight of shame lifting as I unleashed years of suppressed anger, confessing all my grievances toward those who never noticed the real me. I hurled accusations of hypocrisy and fake friendship until my vocal cords burned. But it didn't matter, because there was a primal pleasure in tearing down the very foundation of my own hellish mold of a personality. The reality hit hard, the shattering of my so-called reputation became liberating for a brief moment. Sarah approached, tears glistening in her eyes as I saw her retreat into the depths of disappointment. "Is this who you really are?" she asked, disappointment dripping from every word. An unexpected pang of guilt clawed at me. Was I really this monster pretending to be a victim? As her words hung in the air, I felt the collective breath of the room hold, an audience witnessing what I had become, an unraveled facade. Just as I prepared to apologize, my sanity faded, drowned out by my bitter thoughts, drowning in the realization that I had burned every bridge. Then, I went home, alone, my mind racing with regret and shame. What I had achieved was not the validation I so desperately sought, but rather the uncontrollable manipulation of my own psyche, the birth of a stranger that I had unleashed. From that moment on, I would see their faces pop up on social media, living their lives, laughing, and I would be lying in bed, haunted by the delusion that my outburst was somehow justified. Months passed, and Sarah became nothing more than an echo of a memory, a reminder of the person I couldn't be. My friends faded away, retreating into their own lives, while I was trapped inside a shell. I became a ghost in my own life, haunted by what I had done, each day feeling like I was losing a piece of my soul. I longed for connection, yet wore my shame like a shroud, isolating myself even more. And still, I replayed that night, not with the theatrics of the bravado I had donned, but with the unbearable weight of the regret that would follow me like a shadow. I lost the chance of being anything more than the nice guy, reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. The truth is, when I had my meltdown, I abandoned kindness and let the bitterness consume me whole, showing me the depths of what lurks inside when we allow anger to eclipse reason. To this day, it's a weight I carry, every facet of my identity reshaped, a constant reminder that within a moment of fury lies the power to destroy everything we think we can control. When I was in second grade, I had no idea just how much trouble my curiosity could cause, but the moment I walked into that dimly lit classroom, something ominous took root in my young mind, a seed planted by the whispers of my classmates. They spoke of Ms. Riley, the grumpy old teacher with too many rules and a penchant for punishing anyone who dared to misbehave. But my favorite part about her was that she always had a jar of cookies on her desk, tempting us like forbidden fruit. One day, during recess, I overheard two kids talking about a secret passageway they supposedly found behind the school's decrepit library. My imagination ignited, I could practically hear the whispers of adventure calling me, but when I asked around, no one could confirm if it was real. Fueled by curiosity, I decided that I had to find it myself. So, after school ended, I snuck into the library, heart pounding with both fear and excitement, and there it was, a slightly ajar door behind a bookshelf covered in dust, everyday object turned into a portal to the unknown. I pushed it open, nearly knocking over a stack of ancient encyclopedias, and wandered into a narrow, shadowy corridor lined with flickering bulbs that seemed to hum with their own life. I couldn't resist the thrill washing over me as I tiptoed further in, past walls scrawled with strange symbols and remnants of what looked like long-abandoned classes. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, something I couldn't quite place, but as I ventured deeper, a creeping sense of dread began to settle in my stomach, and I turned back just as the air turned icy and wild laughter echoed behind me from the darkness. In my haste to escape, I bumped into an old pipe that groaned like it was alive, and then it came crashing down, sulphurous fumes filling the air as I stumbled back, panicking. I fled the library, my heart racing, convinced that my adventure had been a grave mistake. The very next day, I returned to school, only to find the playground surrounded by caution tape, the laughter of my friends replaced with nervous whispers. Ms. Riley, who was usually a stickler for rules, had turned ghostly pale, and the principal looked like he was about to lose his marbles. It turned out that my little expedition had triggered a chain reaction of events that left the entire school in a state of chaos. There were reports of gas leaks, and the fire department was called, dragging their equipment through the doors like a scene out of a horror movie. And there I was, at the epicenter of it all, feeling like an innocent child caught in a storm I had unintentionally conjured. My friends stared at me with a mix of admiration and horror. I became the architect of their fear as they spun tales about the mysterious corridor that had unleashed chaos upon our esteemed educational establishment. But things took a darker turn when I learned the school was fined $600 for operational violation due to my reckless wandering, and worst of all, I heard whispers that Ms. Riley was going to make an example out of me, her favorite scapegoat to unleash her fury upon. The fear clung to my bones like a shadow, making me anxious whenever I stepped into the school. My days are spent bracing for the repercussions of my actions. I avoided the library, feeling the watchful eyes of the old books on my back, and I shunned recess, fearing the laughter was tinged with the knowledge of my culpability. But I couldn't escape Ms. Riley's gaze, so all I could do was wait for my reckoning. And then, one fateful Thursday afternoon, it happened. Ms. Riley stood before the entire class, eyes scanning the room like a predator, and before I could even take a breath, she called me out. "You think you can just cause chaos and walk away, don't you, Jacob?" she said, voice clawing at my insides like rusted nails. The laughter erupted around me, each giggle a dagger. It stung worse than I could have imagined, as I felt the weight of the fine hanging over my shoulders like a millstone. Ms. Riley pulled a paper from her desk with a flourish, waving it like a trophy of shame, my name scribbled across the top, the fine looming behind it like a storm cloud. "You, Jacob, will write an apology letter to the school, to me, and to the fire department explaining why you cannot play Third Floor Explorer anymore." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I suffered in silence as the classroom erupted in murmurs. That night, I lay wide awake, staring into the darkened corners of my room, grappling with the reality of my actions. I envisioned that creeping corridor, now pulsating in my mind with an otherworldly presence, as if it was mocking me for my cowardice. I became haunted by the shadows that flickered just beyond my line of sight, echoes of laughter laughing at my missteps, and the stench of that ancient library filled my dreams with reminders of death. Weeks passed, and I continued to live in fear of Ms. Riley's wrath, but then something strange began to happen. The more I dwelled on those terrifying moments in the library, the more I felt as if I developed an odd, twisted connection to the corridor, a tether binding me to something unseen. As if it was sending me a message, a gut feeling that encouraged exploration despite the consequences. One day, I gathered enough courage to confront my fears. I crept back to the library, fueled by a strange pull, and this time, I slipped through the doorway once more. Despite the pit of dread swelling within me, the air felt different, charged with electricity as if the corridor was alive. I stumbled deeper, drawn in by an unseen force, discovering decrepit classrooms filled with dust-covered desks and chalkboards, but there was something more, an aura of otherworldly mystery. Suddenly, in the shadows, I saw it, a twisted version of myself staring back from a cracked mirror, eyes wide open as if they held centuries of secrets. It whispered my name, beckoning me forward. Retreat was impossible now. Just as I reached out to touch the glass, a loud bang shattered the silence, and I whipped around to find walls shifting, the faint outlines of warning signs flickering into existence, urging me to escape. I stumbled backward, realizing that whatever hidden knowledge I sought came at a price, and I rushed back towards the exit, breathless and panicked, the laughter of ghosts echoing behind me. When I burst out into the light of the library, the distance between the shadows and me felt intangible. I ran home, heart racing, where I collapsed onto my bed, my body trembling with the weight of what I'd experienced. I told myself to forget what I saw, the corridor was just a trick of my imagination, a figment of a child's fears. But even now, as I type this, that voice, that mirror, lingers in the corner of my mind, and the thought of those secrets both horrifies and fascinates me. I eventually learned to live with the memory of that day, but sometimes, in the stillness of night, I hear the laughter ring in my ears, echoing off the walls of my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that I might still be connected to that corridor, that something trapped within it still watches and waits, waiting for the next curious child to open a door to chaos, waiting for a repeat of history, and the price of ignorance to be paid once more. It was an ordinary afternoon at the airport, busy with the usual buzz of travelers rushing to catch flights, the echo of rolling suitcases, and the bickering of families navigating the endless lines, but all that changed the moment my foot collided with the large glass door at Gate 7. I had been so distracted by my own racing mind, caught up in anxieties that twisted in my stomach like an uncoiling snake, that I barely registered the people around me until I heard the sickening sound of shattering glass, my heart plummeting as shards sprayed like broken stars across the polished floor. Yet when I instinctively turned to apologize, a strange calm flooded over me because nobody seemed to pause, no one flinched or turned to gawk like you would expect in such an embarrassing moment. Instead, everyone continued on with their lives, as if the shattering glass had been nothing but an echo of the mundane announcements buzzing overhead, and with each loud, reassuring declaration of boarding flights and safety regulations, I felt an overwhelming sense of being in a dream, a surreal world where I was completely invisible, and all I could hear was the frantic thumping of my heart echoing in my ears. As I stood there, feet glued to the tile as shards glittered dangerously at my feet, a creeping dread began to wrap around my throat. I took a deep breath and stepped back, the door now gaping like an empty mouth, and still, no one noticed, not even the security personnel lounging near their posts, seemingly absorbed in their phones, and I scuttled away from the wreckage, my pulse racing while I navigated the labyrinth of concession stands and weary travelers, the absurdity of it all gnawing at me like a missed flight. But in those moments beneath the buzzing neon signs and vast departure boards, I began to feel something dark and eerie creeping in. What would happen if I were to do something else, something no one would see? I wandered through the glossy hallways, captivated by the oscillating stream of faces that seemed more like a surreal tapestry than living beings, and my mind began to widen, envisaging myself pulling open emergency exits, sending alarms into frenzy, only to be ignored as travelers shrugged and walked by. The thought was intoxicating, thrilling. I imagined more glass, more chaos. What if I could throw a chair in the air and it would crack like thunder? Yet I knew it would never happen. The fear of being noticed, of being judged, sat heavily on my shoulders until something inside snapped. Wasn't I already invisible? I could feel the weight of premonition digging into my chest, that palpable darkness whispering to me, winding through my thoughts like smoke until I found myself rummaging through the airport's quiet corners, lost in this strange trance-like state I couldn't shake, the temptation growing as I submerged deeper into the rippling sea of oblivion. And it wasn't long before I stumbled upon another glass door, one that was locked, a creamy frame that gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights, and I couldn't resist. My hand, trembling with a mix of anxiety and exhilaration, reached for my jacket but stopped short, a warning ricocheting in my mind. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay beyond that door had called to me, and I knew I had to know. I took a breath and threw my shoulder against the door. You might expect it to give with gusto, but instead, it crunched as if it were made of tissue, the sound reverberating oddly through the air as it shattered in a slow-motion cascade, a curtain of glass drifting slowly to the floor, and still, nobody turned. I stood, adrenaline coursing through me as I stared blankly into the employees' lounge I'd just exposed. People lounging in worn leather chairs, lying on tables, a few desolate souls staring blankly at their phones, and I felt an inexplicable chill creep down my spine, my own reflection dancing among the chaos as I realized I didn't belong to this world any longer. In a quickened breath, I stepped over the glass and into the vacant room, my mind spiraling with the possibilities of this secret passageway. Yet when I glanced back at the door I had just destroyed, it was gone. Only bare wall remained, as smooth as a canvas, with no remnants of my actions, and my heart thundered in my chest. Panic gripped me as I ran my fingers over the features of the building, emptiness swallowing me whole. I yelled, tried to scream, send warnings through the air, but the silence was absolute, as if I had submerged into a deep, dark abyss, and every shred of consciousness began to slip away until I became just another lost soul in this wild dream. Hours might have passed, or maybe only minutes, before a sing-song voice sliced through the silence, a lilting melody that filled the empty room, and as I turned to face the source, I saw a little girl with pale skin and glimmering eyes standing against the wall where the glass door used to be, her expression eerily calm like her features had been sculpted from candle wax, and she looked at me with unblinking curiosity, asking, "Are you going to come play with us?" Her voice echoed, sending chills racing across my skin, and behind her, shadows flickered, hints of figures in the gloom, all watching in hushed stillness as they melted into view, their faces twisted into mocking smiles that seemed too wide, crossing the line between happiness and something far darker. One, a man with ragged clothes and hollow eyes, started to hum an unsettling tune, and my instincts screamed for me to flee, but together, they captured me in their web, and I stood frozen at their periphery, something deep inside whispering that as long as I had shattered that glass, I would never leave this place. Yet the girl stepped closer, her laugh chiming like broken bells that rang in my ears, and then I felt it, the stinging realization that this terror was now my prison. And as the world beyond the walls continued to spin in indifference to my shattered reality, I knew my actions had unveiled something far beyond my understanding. This was no longer an airport, and I was no longer just some invisible traveler. I had unlocked a door that was never meant to open, and soon I would have to decide whether to play along or become another whisper among the echoes. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, but the lure of quick steam points became an obsession I couldn't resist. You see, I was living paycheck to paycheck, my gaming habits slowly suffocating my bank account, and then, one dark evening during a particularly grueling half-hearted scroll through the gaming subreddits, I stumbled across a thread titled "The Dark Side of Digital Services," where users claimed you could earn Steam points by completing increasingly bizarre tasks for anonymous clients, the kinds of things you'd never tell your friends about. Curiosity nagging at my mind, I clicked on it, and after some convincing shadowy exchanges in private messages, I found myself chatting with someone who insisted they would pay handsomely for an intimate digital experience, and while my gut twisted at the implications, my desire for the newest game release overshadowed my better judgment, so I agreed, not really understanding what it would entail. They sent me a series of instructions, a bizarre script filled with euphemisms and gamer slang, absolutely ridiculous language that felt more akin to a crude fan fiction than anything else, but the promise of 10,000 Steam points burned in my mind like a neon sign at a pitch-black intersection, leading me deeper into madness. And after exchanging a few lines of banter, I was thrusting my fingers over my keyboard in a dance of embarrassment, typing out phrases that made my face burn hotter than 1,000 suns as they sent me back more and more intense requests, and despite the ludicrousness of it all, I found myself more engaged as they would ping my overlay, turning every mundane word into a slow spiral of absurdity and titillation. But then the playful tone suddenly shifted when they began asking for personal details, a name, a location, anything that could anchor them to me. I hesitated, the weight of secrecy and shame resting on my shoulders, sensing something dark lurking just behind the curtain of the virtual world, but the allure of those points beckoned me deeper, stronger than any moral compass I might have had, and against my better judgment, I tossed out a detail or two, light and whimsical, even convincing myself it was all harmless fun. That's when the atmosphere warped, the chat abruptly turning sour as this faceless user began sending unsettling messages, demanding I validate my commitment with ludicrous claims of digital domination, culminating in a request that twisted my stomach, insisting that I literally acknowledge their control over me by performing the outlandish tasks they had in mind in some twisted livestream format, and the fear sank in. But then I saw the digits flash before me. I had exchanged the virtual for the tangible, hovering over the prompts that would unlock my points, and in the depths of indecision I acquiesced, cringing back on my desk chair, the tingling sense of dread solidifying the reality of my decision. I prepared to do something I had never imagined myself capable of, my heart racing as I reached that point of no return, anxiety mixing with utter embarrassment. But it didn't feel like I was losing my dignity as much as unraveling the essence of my humanity in front of a nameless stranger who would be able to drown my soul through electric currents and pixelated screens. And just as I finally typed the last line, the screen flickered ominously, an error message dancing angrily before me. But before I could backpedal, the last prompt appeared, covered in a sinister red hue, demanding not just the performance but the account switch as well. Suddenly, I wasn't just giving of myself digitally, I was being pulled into a web where my identity bled into pixels and lines of code, becoming a disposable identity at the mercy of some twisted puppeteer, and panic lifted me from my seat as I tried to disconnect, desperately attempting to shut down my laptop, but the screen wouldn't respond, the keys now sticky under my trembling fingers as a sinister laugh echoed through my speakers, sending chills coursing through me. heart pounding louder than the voice in my head warning me to run. It felt like the room began to swirl around me as I struggled for control, but that's when I saw it, the user presence becoming a solid ghost in the chat, an ominous series of numbers near my digital footprint, and the final message glowed incandescently, a chilling ultimatum: you wanted the points, but what are you willing to lose to keep your account? It's time to make a deal. Ever since I stumbled upon that old, worn-out mattress in the alley behind my apartment complex, my life took a turn I never anticipated. It was filthy and covered in mystery stains, but the moment I laid down, something shifted within me and gave me this transcendent sense of comfort I'd been chasing my whole life. It was like the weight of the world evaporated, and each night thereafter I felt an irresistible pull to surrender myself to that hard, cold floor rather than crawl into my perfectly good bed, and at first, I tried to fight it, told myself that I was being ridiculous, but the compelling urge only grew stronger, a siren's call, whispering promises of rest and escape I couldn't resist. Each night curled into the embrace of the floor sent ripples of euphoria through me. That mattress had opened up a door to a level of dreams that felt so real, so rich, that I wished I could stay within those vivid landscapes forever. I began to dream vividly. I could fly over cities I'd never seen, dive deep into the ocean and swim with translucent creatures, feel the warmth of a sun that didn't scorch, only caressed, and often, oddly enough, I found another presence beside me in those dreams. Someone with a familiar touch but a face I struggled to see clearly, though I could feel their warmth radiating, grounding me, as if I belonged to them. And in the mornings, waking up on that hard floor left me feeling invigorated, as if the air itself buzzed with life and possibility. Sometimes I would forget to grab my coffee. Instead, I bask in the fluttering joy that filled my chest, convinced that I had found my new mantra in life. Why bother with the comforts of a bed filled with sheets and pillows when this rough existence brought such elation? My body grew accustomed to the uneven ground and the ache seemed trivial compared to the wonders I visited each night. Friends started to express concern when they saw the state of me, dark circles forming, a wild look in my eyes, but I brushed them off, murmuring about how freeing it was to sleep low and close to the earth, nonchalantly downplaying the magic that enveloped me every time I sank into slumber. As days turned to weeks, I lost track of time. I didn't mind missing out on gatherings or late-night bar hops, and soon I noticed the odd synchronicities in my dreams, faces from my past, strangers who felt familiar, encounters that felt eerily prophetic. I'd wake, drenched in a cold sweat, mind racing with newfound fears. A recurring shadow began to follow me down the corridors of my dreams, an ever-tightening noose that suggested it wanted something, and while part of me shuddered, the other part delighted in the thrill of it all. The line between normalcy and the enchanted began to blur, and I still wouldn't quit sleeping on the floor, soaked in anticipation for what lay on the other side of sleep. I document my dreams fervently, each night crafting a map of my experiences, a journal that looked more and more like scattered attempts at legacy building rather than simple reminiscences. I could tell the shadow wanted me. It was dark and often shapeless, always lurking at the edges of my consciousness, forcing whispers into my ears, but they wouldn't translate into cohesive words, only muffled interactions that lured me further into a complexity I couldn't disentangle myself from. My mornings darkened then, turning sharp and jagged, the pleasure of a day starting anew replaced with dread, yet I clung to the floor like it was an anchor, keeping me tethered to the unknown. One day I woke up late, the sun casting long shadows, and as I had not left my floor in a while, my stomach growled with hunger while I stretched stiffly on the ground, and that was when I saw it, a letter, yellowed and crumpled, left lying near my head. It bore no address or signature, just a chilling phrase that read, "You didn't remember, did you?" A jolt of panic coursed through me, my heart racing as I scanned the room for signs of someone else's presence. I crumpled the letter with trembling fingers and forced myself to breathe, but it only ignited my obsession to return to the dreamscape, as if the needs of my subconscious were crying out for clarification. As that night took over, I surrendered once more to the pull of the floor, the allure of the dreams far too seductive to resist, and when I finally descended into sleep, twisted emotions battled within me, visions both beautiful and terrifying swirling together until they crystallized into the most vivid dream of all. I was standing before a mirror in an echoing hall surrounded by mutilated reflections of myself, voices screaming in dissonance behind me, as the shadow loomed larger, stretching its limbs to grasp me, and suddenly I understood, it was not a shapeless what, but a who, a reflection of myself I had abandoned in my relentless pursuit of bliss on the floor. It began whispering my name, promising the power of forgetting all the pain and hurt, and just as I thought I could lose myself in its siren call forever, I saw my tranquil self, the one who lay on the floor and sought solace, suffer, writhing as it faded like smoke and mirrors to give way to the truth that still lingered in my waking hours. That this was not a new existence but a prison, dragging my weary soul ever deeper, forcing me to face the terror of isolation that flickered like a dying flame. And then I woke up again on the hardwood floor as the morning light poured in, feeling the crushing weight of hopeless emptiness thrumming in the air around me. I had hoped to reject it, but I could never stop sleeping on the floor. It's bloody amazing, a seductive dream that might end up swallowing me whole. I tipped the massage therapist $10 because I am cheap, but as I lay there in the dimly lit room, something sinister began to unravel around me, an experience I never anticipated when I walked into that unassuming spa. It began like any other day, tired from too many hours hunched over a computer. I sought solace in the promise of a deep tissue massage. The air inside was thick with the fragrance of eucalyptus, and soft music played lullabies of relaxation, luring me into a false sense of security as I was greeted by a woman named Elena, whose hands were said to work magic yet appeared to carry the weight of something more malevolent. As she began kneading my knots, I leisurely drifted into a blissful state, every ounce of tension uncoiling under her deft touch. But that bliss was short-lived, a strange heaviness replaced it, a sensation of being watched that prickled on the back of my neck, and when I glanced up, I saw a shadow shifting just outside the frosted glass door. But Elena didn't seem to notice, her eyes fixated with unnerving intensity on the structure of my back. I forced myself to look away, but a suppressed feeling churned in my stomach. Something was off, something beyond the mystique of relaxation that this spa promised. Then came the whispers, soft and indistinct, echoing against the calm. "You shouldn't have tipped her," they seemed to say, emanating from nowhere and everywhere all at once, worming their way into my consciousness. I gasped silently, my heart signing a frantic rhythm against my ribcage as the pressure increased with every stroke of her hands. "What a pity, you didn't learn," the voice continued, each word like ice water splashed against my skin. I could feel Ella pressing down harder, the massage turning into something more like a treatment of punishment, an overwhelming force that threatened to crush the very bones in my body. Suddenly, the lights flickered ominously, and in that moment of disorientation, I could have sworn I saw a figure flitting past the opaque glass, a gaunt face with hollow eyes staring in through the door. Panic surged through me. I needed to leave, to bolt from that table and never look back, but the weight of her hands felt like iron shackles holding me down. "Relax," Elena commanded gently, and despite myself, I felt a compulsion to obey. With every passing minute, the intensity of the whispers elevated, the voices pleading with me to heed the warning they presented, but who was I to question the depths of something I could not fully grasp? I tried to speak, to tell her to stop, to call for help, but my voice escaped into the ether, reduced to mere silence amid the cacophony of those ominous murmurs around me. Then, out of nowhere, a sliver of sunlight breached the cracks of the room, illuminating something dreadful. A collection of framed photos hung on the wall, each depicting a former client, the faces twisted in agonized rapture, frozen in those moments as if trapped in time. My blood ran cold as I recognized them, friends who had told me how rejuvenating their experience had been, how they felt lighter, happier, transformed. Each joyful smile now showcased the horror of what they had become. One face stood out, that of my friend Claire, her expression caught in a mask of ecstasy that bled into despair. The spark in her eyes dimmed to an empty void. Desperation clawed at my insides as a cold realization sank in like poison. Those voices, those muffled warnings were cries of the damned, victims of the secrecy between the spa therapist and the darkness behind the wall. I wanted to escape, yet my limbs felt impossibly heavy, as if every stroke from her hand siphoned away my strength, teasing out the essence of who I was until I would be just like them, captured eternally in blissful misery. With one last surge of willpower, I mustered the remnants of my strength and propelled myself off the table, crashing to the floor, but as I scrambled for the door, a chortle escaped her lips, an unsettling melody of control, hearing my broken breath spill all around as the room darkened, the shadows stretching out like fingers eager to grasp me. "You're not going anywhere," Elena's voice echoed, echoing through the abyss that enveloped us and drowning out the whispers turned wails behind me. I kicked the door, desperate and frantic, but it wouldn't budge, and when I turned back, the room had transformed. The walls morphed with grotesque limbs stretching toward me, snapping the air between us, sinister smiles glimmering in the half-light as if they knew fate wrapped closer around my throat. I dashed toward the window, the only remaining hope, but the moment I reached it, the frost turned to glass, slick and impenetrable, reflecting the disarray in my mind and trapping me in my own confusion. That was when I heard the most bone-chilling moment of all. Behind me, Elena laughed softly, the sound reverberating with the sinister promise of those she had claimed, and through the tortured fabric of reality, I understood. I was marked now, a thread in her tapestry, destined to join their ranks in that photo, smiling through sheer pain. In one final desperate plea, I mustered all the strength I had left and slammed my fist against the glass, the sound reverberating through the mocking hall, a stony reminder that my cheapness had led me here. All I had wanted was a moment of relaxation, and now, I was poised to become another victim of Elena's twisted hauntings, with nothing but a cursed understanding that sometimes the price you pay for comfort is far more costly than you could ever anticipate. I'll never forget the night everything changed, how something so ordinary transformed into something haunted by a darkness I never saw coming. It all started when my friend with benefits, Jess, invited me over to her place after a long week of classes and work, and obviously, I was eager to unwind, to lose myself momentarily in the comfort of our arrangement that was free of strings but filled with heat and laughter. We settled onto her couch, the air thick with tension as we exchanged playful banter, and I thought about how well I knew her, the way her hair cascaded down her back, the mischievous glint in her eyes, the way she made my skin prick with anticipation. When she suggested we take it to the bedroom, I could hardly contain my excitement. However, in the back of my mind that night, I felt something strange. The house was uncharacteristically quiet, too quiet, as if the walls were listening, holding their breath. Our usual routine quickly escalated, and the thrill of the moment took over as we lost ourselves in a whirlwind of passion, the world around us fading until it was just us, breathing hard under the dim glow of her bedside lamp. In a moment of pure adrenaline, as I leaned forward, my hand braced awkwardly against the edge of the bed, the weight of my body shifted unexpectedly, and I heard a snapping sound, a sharp, sickening crack, that echoed like a low thunderclap within the confines of that intimate space. Pain exploded through my arm, the kind of agony that makes you question every decision that led to that moment, and through the haze of shock, I glanced down to see my forearm at an unnatural angle, the skin stretched tight against the bone, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me as I processed what just happened, while Jess gasped in horror, her playful demeanor dissolving into panic. She rushed to my side, her hands trembling against my skin as I struggled to breathe, each gasp turning into a low whimper as I fought against the pain coursing through me, and when I looked up at her, her face was pale, eyes wide with a mix of concern and disbelief, and all I could think was how this wasn't how nights like this were supposed to go, how intimacy at its rawest turned into this twisted nightmare. The sound of sirens pierced the air minutes later as Jess called for help, her voice shaking as she tried to keep it together while my world faded in and out, the edges of my vision darkening with every passing moment. They took me to the hospital, and there I lay, alone in a sterile room, wincing as they carefully aligned my broken arm, the dull throb contrasting sharply with the chaos of my racing heart. Hours later, when I was discharged, I could only think about how Jess must have been affected by all of this, how something so innocent and intimate could suddenly carry with it an unshakable weight. I returned home, my arm hanging limply in a makeshift sling, but the real torment came in the days that followed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that in the midst of my pain, I'd somehow summoned a darkness that lurked just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to creep in. Jess texted me later that week, concerned about how I was holding up, but I could hear the hesitance in her words, as if our connection had fractured alongside my arm, and the nights dragged on, filled with nightmares of shadows dancing at the edge of my perception. On one particularly restless night, I found myself pacing my living room, the broken silence pressing in on me, a feeling that something was standing just behind me, lurking in the half-light. My phone buzzed, and it was Jess again, this time asking if we could talk, her voice trembling with an urgency that sent my heart racing. I sensed a change in her tone, a gravity that pulled my stomach tight as she begged me to meet her. When I arrived at her place the next day, I found the front door slightly ajar, panic unfurling in my chest as I entered. The house felt cold, a stark contrast to the warm bubble we had created before, and as I called out her name, an unsettling silence answered, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. I ventured deeper into the house and into her bedroom, where the familiar scent of her perfume danced in the air. On the walls hung pictures of us, smiles frozen in time, but something about the images felt distorted, sinister. The shadows behind us were darker than I remembered, and something within me whispered that those moments we had shared had morphed into something altogether different. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that felt otherworldly, and fear clawed at my throat as I fumbled for the handle, desperately pulling, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed a figure in the corner, someone standing in the murkiness with a silhouette too skewed to truly make out. My heart raced as I stumbled back, breath coming in shallow gasps, and the figure stepped forward, a tall, gaunt creature with Jess's face but vacant eyes, utterly devoid of warmth and familiarity, a reflection of the dark energy that had seeped into our lives since that fateful night. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, the sound twisting in my ears like a knife, and before I could comprehend it, the thing lunged at me, a whirlwind of shadows and despair. I barely managed to dodge as it tackled the space where I'd stood, crashing into the wall with a violent thud, and I bolted toward the door, adrenaline surging through me, the panic of never escaping this torment twisting my gut tighter. The handle finally yielded to my desperate grabbing, and I flung myself into the hallway, gasping for air, but all I could think was how every laugh we'd shared morphed into premonitions of something terrible, how every passionate moment had left an imprint too deep to wash away, as the memories of our best times now haunted me like a relentless specter. I never saw Jess again after that night. Never heard her voice or saw her smile, and it took weeks to piece my life back together, but every single day was tainted with the echo of that moment, the house, the figure, the sense that I had breached a dark undercurrent that lay just below the surface of our lives. The broken arm healed, but the fractures in my reality stayed, unshakable reminders of a connection that was never meant to be, a pact of twisted fate forged in the heat of passion that spiraled into an abyss I could never understand. Even now, as I recount this tale, the shadows gather at the edges of my life, and I dread the moment they might finally consume me whole. I can still hear the creaking floorboards of my apartment, the way they groaned under the weight of the forgotten secrets that seemed to linger in every shadow, but that day was different. Despite the mid-afternoon light filtering through the blinds, casting striped patterns on the walls, I felt an unshakable heaviness in the air, a residue of dread that clung to me like static electricity. I'd invited my friend Jake over to share a meal, but my idea of a lunch date was about to spiral into something that would unravel not only our friendship but the very fabric of my sanity. I was attempting to impress him with my newfound obsession for health, whipping up a salad that looked more like a work of art than a meal, complete with organic arugula, heirloom tomatoes, and a drizzle of balsamic that I had learned to make myself. Not to mention, I had one of those fancy kitchen gadgets that spun leafy greens dry with the flourish of a magician, but as I chopped and mixed, a faint whisper of intuition nagged at the back of my mind, the nagging sense that I was being watched, an unshakable itch that made the hair on my arms stand on end, and while I brushed it off as paranoia, the feeling grew sharper the closer Jake's arrival approached. When he finally walked through the door, his easy smile momentarily soothed the prickle of anxiety that was gathering at my nape like the prelude to a storm. But the moment the door clicked shut, everything shifted. Jake's eyes darted around the living room, a shadow crossing his face, and for a split second, I saw something dark flicker in his gaze, accompanied by a strange tremor in his voice. As he complimented the salad, I felt a pang of unease as I noticed that neither of us could quite shake the feeling that we were no longer alone, an inhabitant lurking just beyond the periphery of our vision, an unsettled energy increasingly manifesting in the room, a heat pulsating beneath every ordinary surface, and yet I laughed off the anxiety like an unwanted house guest, convincing myself it was merely a figment of my overactive imagination. We sat down to eat, the vibrant colors of the salad contrasting sharply with the familiar surroundings, and as we dug into our bowls, the tension in the air morphed into something more palpable, saturating every bite, until Jake suddenly froze, eyes wide and unblinking, his fork hovering above his plate as he glanced toward the window. My heart began to race as he whispered, "Do you hear that?" That was when I realized the room had gone eerily silent, the mundane sounds of the outside world stifled as if sealed under glass, and just when I thought of dismissing it as nothing, I saw it, a figure in the reflection of the window, standing just out of reach on the fire escape, a long shadow stretching unnaturally against the bricks, and I instinctively but painfully squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was a trick of the light. But when I opened them again, nothing had changed except for the icy grip of fear tightening around my chest. Jake's breath quickened, and something flickered across his face. Was it recognition? But before I could process what was happening, the sound I had been dreading filled the air, a deep, guttural growl seeping through the walls as if my apartment itself was exhaling a long-held breath, and the light bulbs began to flicker, plunging us in and out of darkness as the figure continued to lurk outside, and as it stepped forward, I noticed what it was holding, a knife, glinting malevolently in the brief flashes of light. Jake turned to me, eyes wide with terror, and before I could speak, a cold realization sank in. He didn't just look frightened, he was terrified in a way that betrayed years of hidden knowledge, as if he recognized the threat with all too familiar terror. The color drained from his face as he pushed his chair back, making it screech against the floor like nails on a chalkboard, and in that dreadful moment, I understood, it wasn't just the figure beyond the window we should fear but something far worse. Jake's face twisted in horror, and he whispered, "Don't let it in." revealing that my seemingly innocent lunch had morphed into a battleground for survival. But just as I grasped the magnitude of our peril, my curiosity pushed me past the border of reason, compelling me toward the window, and that's when I began to feel a cold breeze, a whispering malevolence curling around me, and the moment I looked out, the figure flashed its blade toward me, its face veiled in darkness yet unmistakably human, with a smile that chilled my very soul, and in that instant, I felt the terrible weight of discovery. The figure wasn't an intruder at all, it was a reflection of everything I had ever tried to conceal, a version of myself I had buried out of shame, the darkness of my own mind given flesh and bone, and no amount of salad dressing could drown out the realization that I had laid out a feast for this very monstrosity. My best friend got me pregnant when I was 16, and I never told anyone, and as I sit here on the edge of my bed writing this down, I feel a chill crawl up my spine. I could almost forget it if I tried hard enough. But that twisted summer changed everything, when we were just kids playing an innocent game of truth or dare, where secrets poured out like cheap wine, the air thick with laughter and soft summer breezes, all until the dare turned into something neither of us expected. As we sat cloaked in the shadows of the trees behind my house, hearts racing from the thrill of it all, we made a pact to embrace our curiosity, chocolate bar wrappers and laughter littering our spot just like the moments that would soon turn into mistakes that felt more like choices. And on that night, under the ghostly glow of the moon, we crossed a line that would haunt me for the rest of my life. At first, everything felt euphoric, like we were untouchable, but when the weight of what we'd done settled heavily in my stomach, reality caught up too fast. I started feeling different, drifting into dark corners of my mind where I would choke on the truth I carried like a lead ball, and as the days blurred into weeks, the little signs began to unveil a secret I couldn't face. Each morning was a new battle as I tiptoed around my own body, anxious and afraid. I didn't want to ruin what we had, didn't want to shatter our friendship into 1,000 jagged pieces that could never be glued back together, and with every missed period and every queasy morning, I could hear my own heart pounding like a death knell reminding me of my choices, and still, I said nothing, not to him, not to my parents, not even to the friends who'd sensed my absence from the normally vibrant girl they once knew. I felt like a ghost hovering above my skin, and when I finally summoned the courage to take a pregnancy test, the 2 pink lines felt like a betrayal, hissed closer to me than any secret I could keep. I buried it deep within myself, feeling it claw away at my insides like an unholy creature demanding to be acknowledged, but I shut that part of me off, replaced my shame with an act, a performance of normality as we still hung out, laughed, and did all the things that best friends do, me hiding behind an ever-thickening facade until one dreadful day in October when the truth became too much to bear, and everything spiraled out of my control. I was at school, the world moving around me in a familiar haze, peering at my reflection in the cloudy bathroom stall mirror as I felt the familiar grip of nausea squeeze my throat. Only this time it wasn't just the weight of my secret, something in the air shifted, and as I stumbled to the nearest toilet, the urge to retch took hold like a vicious storm. My body reacted violently, and among my chaotic tears, the world turned black and blurry until I was pulled back to reality by icy hands. Someone was screaming, a teacher, the panicked faces of classmates peering in through the bathroom door while I curled up, practically cradling this secret that clawed at the edges of my mind, my blood pounding in my ears. I couldn't let anyone know, couldn't let it change my life, but they pulled me out while I fought to shield my truth like it was my heart itself, and I could only hear their whispers and cries of concern morph into the grating noise of betrayal as I lied and spun a web of half-truths, telling them I'd just had a bad taco or something simple, painfully aware of the razor-edged truth lying beneath the surface. My best friend rushed to my side later, and I could feel the remorse rippling between us like an electrical current, a whirlwind of guilt dancing in the air. It was clear that the secrets we carried morphed into a silent burden that was growing heavier every day, but neither of us dared to speak it. The weeks crawled by until the undeniable truth screamed its presence through crimson-stained fabric that would grow thicker. An unexpected pounding at my door one evening made my heart go cold, and I opened it to find him standing there, weary eyes that mirrored the weight of everything we'd buried. "We need to talk," he said, and as I invited him in, the moment felt like stepping onto a battlefield. And I met him in the living room where I thought the light might save us, but the darkness was relentless. It poured out of my mouth, the truth spilled like an overfilled glass, and in that singular moment, everything shifted. Tears flowed freely as I called out for help, his face twisted with disbelief before it fell away, replaced with sadness, and I could hear the slow clenching of his fists, our failure to acknowledge this void that had grown between us, one touch igniting the spark of what could have been while monsters of the past began to rattle within me. And I braced for a fight that would lay us bare. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was a whisper, but it tore through me, and I replied, "Because I didn't want to ruin everything we had. I thought you'd hate me." My heart raced, words crashing like waves as the air grew thicker, a brewing storm gathering power around us, and our honesty lifted the veil, revealing the consequences of our actions while leaving us painfully stranded. What do you do when you've lost yourself to a mistake that shapes the very core of who you are? The world outside grew quieter as the depths of our silence stretched, until I found myself staring into those unfathomable eyes, and I saw the flicker of something igniting. Our hearts were racing in sync, but the bond we'd shared was now a tangled mess of fear, obligation, and impending fatherhood. He reached out, gingerly tracing the contours of my cheek, the most comforting of gestures, but the kiss that followed felt like a goodbye and hellos wrapped in one, like two souls realizing they were meant for different paths. And with a broken heart, I did the only thing I could. I stepped back, sealing away the truth of my body. My life twisted in the spirals of a decision I had no control over, knowing I could never change what had happened, and now, I must live with it tucked deep within, far away from prying eyes, hidden among broken memories and shards of what was. I used to pride myself on keeping my life free of drama. I was the kind of person who stepped around conflicts instead of wading through them. But one sweltering day in August, my carefully constructed world unraveled. It all started when I found myself in a crowded parking lot at the mall, wrestling with a deeply buried sense of frustration after a string of unfortunate events. The air was thick with exhaust, heat rising off the blacktop, and I felt that simmering irritation bubble over as I watched people casually jog back to their cars, laughing and shouting, while I gripped the edge of my shopping bag like a lifeline. As I turned to head back to my own car, I noticed a ridiculously shiny, red convertible parked right next to me, a gaudy, ostentatious vehicle that radiated vanity and entitlement. The urge to lash out bubbled up within me like carbonation fizzing out of control. My impulse to ruin someone's day became irresistible. I took a deep breath, forced a tight smile, and approached the car. It was just a harmless prank, I reasoned. I fished my keys out of my pocket, my heart racing at the idea of the scratch I was about to commit, envisioning the owner's face when they discovered the ugly line etched into their precious toy that would haunt them every time they glanced out of their window. I leaned in, pretending to tie my shoe, and let the jagged edge of my key dance across the surface, the metal biting into the paint as a wave of ridiculous glee crashed over me. But just as I stepped back, adrenaline coursing through my veins, I felt a sudden chill wash over me, the kind that tells you you're not alone. A sense of being watched crept over me, and I whipped my head around, scanning the lot. That's when I saw her, a woman with long, tangled hair and piercing green eyes, staring directly at me, her gaze unwavering, as if she had been there the whole time, silently judging me. Panic surged as I glanced back at the convertible, expecting to see her screaming or storming toward me, that villain on the other side of my selfish act, but instead, she lingered, a small, unnerving smile curling at her lips. A shiver weaved through my spine, but I shook it off and briskly walked to my own car, eager to escape the impending sense of doom. Days passed, and an unsettling feeling nestled deep within me, amplifying every minor inconvenience that came my way. The sound of car doors slamming became increasingly jarring, and I began seeing the woman everywhere, sipping coffee at the cafe, buying groceries, standing just beyond the doors of my workplace, her vibrant green eyes tracking me no matter how hard I tried to justify my behavior, no matter how far I ran. It was like I had inadvertently opened a door I couldn't close, a horror I could not shake. At night, I lay awake, heart pounding, convinced that every shadow outside my window was her, creeping closer, her smile widening like a sinister grin. Then came the night she finally showed up at my house. Standing motionless on the sidewalk, a featureless figure backlit by the street lamp, her long hair obscuring her face, I was frozen in terror. Gathering enough courage, I cracked the front door open, curious to see her expression, to hear her voice, but as I did, I could see that unsettling smile plastered on her face, eerily patient. "You made a mistake," she whispered, her voice as soft as silk but layered with venom, and a knot formed in my stomach as I realized I wasn't just a rat in a maze of my own making, there was something far worse at play. All the moments of panic came crashing together, and I started to understand that my act of malice had consequences, interconnected with something dark, something much larger than just a petty act of vandalism. I had set off an itch that scratched beneath my skin, something that wouldn't be pleased until it had taken its due. Over the next few weeks, I became haunted by a series of unexplainable events. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere on a desolate road, my phone kept dying at crucial moments, and I stumbled into horrifying accidents as if she were orchestrating my downfall. There was no respite, no way to escape her grasp. The very air around me felt heavy with her intentions. Friends stopped calling, my coworkers began to look at me with concern, and my reflection warped in the mirror as paranoia seeped into my mind with a relentless elixir. I knew I couldn't hide forever. With each passing day, I was becoming less of a person and more a shell, hollowed out by fear. In desperation, I started researching the possibility of curses and hexes and came across a cult that practiced retribution for those who wronged others. I had to make amends, to restore balance, but how could I, after what I had done? I decided I could find the woman and apologize. Perhaps she would understand that it was a momentary loss of sanity, that the ugly impulse wasn't really me. But as I combed the neighborhood, the cafes, the park, the shops, she always seemed a step ahead, her eyes watching from a distance, silently reminding me of my crime. The only sound punctuating the air was the laughter of families enjoying their day unmarred by my despair. In a moment of utter defeat and insanity, I drove back to that parking lot, hoping against hope that she'd be there so I could make things right. Alas, the convertible was gone, replaced by mundane sedan, but I could feel her watching from the shadows. As I paced the lot, desperation clawing at my insides, I stumbled into a small truck parked at the edge, and there upon the windshield was a note, "You can't escape your sins." My blood turned to ice, the words felt alive, dripping with menace. I backed up, the click of keys echoed like a gunshot. Suddenly, I noticed the woman materialized beside the truck. In the half-light, her smile morphed into something grotesque, stretching unnaturally, hauntingly, and I realized this was not over. Not for me. Not ever. The last thing I saw before everything faded into darkness was her hand gripping my arm, pulling me back into the shadows, leaving me with a horrifying realization that I was trapped in my own twisted fate, my act of cruelty reverberating endlessly, an inescapable loop of misery that would take control of my soul. It all started on a restless night, 3 decades since I last saw her, the girl from high school, the one whose smile could light up even the darkest corners of my memory, and yet, here I was, unable to shake the haunting image of her from my mind, like a deep-seated craving that grew stronger with each passing year. I spent those years trapped in a monotonous cycle of work and obligations, convinced I'd long since buried those teenage feelings, but then a chance encounter sent me spiraling back down that memory lane, a weathered yearbook, miraculously found in a dusty attic, filled with smiling faces and careless inscriptions that taunted me with sweet nostalgia and buried regrets. Among them, her name, Megan, jumped off the page, coated in the bright colors of youth, and memories came flooding back, the way she'd laugh at my terrible jokes, the way her hair shimmered in the summer sun, and that fateful day at the prom when I stood frozen in fear watching her dance with someone else, a handsome jock who took my breath away and shattered my heart in the process. I couldn't help but remember the last time we spoke, sitting on the bleachers after a football game, confessing our dreams and fears, moments frozen in time until the cruel hand of adulthood forced us to forget. After that night, life took us on separate paths, and soon I lost track of her, but those soft memories began to twist into an obsession as I found myself searching for her online, poring over social media profiles, always expecting to find her vibrant smile lighting up my feed as if she had never stopped existing in the world, only to discover nothing, no trace of Megan since our graduation. It felt as if the memories were a vivid dream I had awakened from, a sweet and bitter phantom haunting my thoughts. With each sleepless night, the obsession consumed me. I discovered I had memorized every detail of her life that I could recall, where she sat in class, the smell of her perfume, the way she twirled her hair around her fingers when she was lost in thought, and I began to wonder almost obsessively if she remembered me at all. It was during this obsessive search that I stumbled upon an old blog post written by a mutual friend that recounted a bizarre and tragic event. Megan had disappeared just days before our graduation, leaving behind only questions and rumors that swirled like a storm. Some said she ran away to escape the suffocating expectations of her family, while others whispered about a darker fate as tales emerged of sightings near the old abandoned rail yard where we used to play. I felt a chill run down my spine that evening as shadows stretched across the walls, the sun dipping low, and all I could think about was finding her and bringing closure to my haunted heart. Fueled by desperation, I visited the rail yard that weekend, armed with nothing but an old flashlight in the desperate hope that the stories were false, that Megan was somewhere safe, laughing at the silliness of our bygone days. But what met my eyes was something else altogether. The air was thick with a biting chill as I waded through weeds and rusted metal, and just as I was ready to turn back, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the distance, unmistakably a figure hidden behind the tangled shadows. My heart raced, the same height, the same silhouette, and I hesitated only for a moment before racing towards it, calling out her name, the sound echoing off the derelict walls around me, and as I approached, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum, the figure slowly turned towards me, and I froze in disbelief. The woman who stood before me looked just like Megan, her hair a bit longer and her eyes as expressive as I remembered, but there was a distant hollowness within them, something far beyond the joy that once defined her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the very air held its breath, and all my carefully constructed questions flew out of my mind, replaced instead with a cold wave of dread as I tried to speak, suddenly aware of a chilling realization: I had spoken her name earlier without knowing she would recognize it. I took a step back, instinctively frightened, and that's when I noticed her arms were marked with scars that traced her skin like a tragic map of past battles. I stammered, "Megan? Is it really you?" She took a step closer, scrutinizing my face as if trying to reconcile it with memory, and just as I glimpsed a flicker of recognition, her expression darkened, her voice dropping to a strained whisper as she warned me, "You shouldn't have come here," and something deep in her gaze, something terrified and desperate, forced to chill through my bones, that screamed this was not a reunion but a warning. I turned to flee, the chilling weight of dread clawing at my insides as I stumbled backward, tripping over twisted metal and overgrown roots, and as I ran, I could hear her breath behind me, this far too familiar and haunting sound carrying the weight of lost years. It felt as if the air itself thickened around me, as if the shadows whispered secrets I'd never want to know, and just when I thought I had escaped, a desperate laugh echoed through the graveyard of memories, the sound warping into a cacophony that chased me all the way home. I locked the door, heart racing, desperately trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was the product of a feverish imagination, but that night, sleep would not come. Her laughter danced in my ears, and my dreams became battlegrounds filled with fragmented memories and fleeting visions of a girl who was never truly lost. In the following days, I found myself drawn back to that wretched rail yard, compelled by a strange force I could neither understand nor resist, knowing I was chasing the shadows of an impossible reunion. Each night grew darker, and I felt her presence stalking me, looming just outside the edge of my consciousness, and then the messages started appearing. A series of bizarre notes slipped under my door that bore unsettling reminders of things only she could know, intimate secrets turned macabre, thoughts that haunted me, like why I never asked her to prom, why I let her slip through my fingers, each note drenched in an eerie familiarity that churned the depths of my stomach. These were messages that shattered everything I believed about her disappearance, each laden with the suggestion that perhaps the girl I once loved never actually left but had been trapped in purgatory, where darkness and memories blurred. After relentless nights filled with dread, I finally mustered the courage to investigate further, returning to the rail yard armed with nothing but a pathetic sense of purpose, and as I walked the twisted passages of rust and decay, I felt her watching me, her presence like an electric current beneath my skin, and suddenly, the shadows began to laugh, taunting me with the violence of the past until I reached the very spot where I had first spotted her. A cold shiver framed my heart with terror, but within that darkness, I thought I heard her voice calling to me, beckoning me closer, as a fierce storm of longing raged in my heart. With shaky hands, I reached out for the rotting wood that groaned underfoot, and as I took a deep breath, prepared to say her name one more time, a deafening voice shattered the gloom, "You shouldn't have come here." Surged by desperation and fear, I lurched backward just as the earth split wide beneath me, cold hands clawing at my ankles, tethering me to a past I could not escape, as the whispers transformed into echoes of a bygone laughter that ignited the flames of the very memories I had tried so hard to forget. And with each heartbeat, I was dragged deeper into the dark abyss, realizing at last that sometimes time is a cruel trickster, holding on to the things we think we've lost, forcing us to confront a haunting truth, that escape is never possible when the ghosts of our past still linger. And in the end, all I could think was that maybe it wasn't she who was lost, but me, trapped forever in a twisted reflection of the life I wished I could have shared with the girl I once loved. This weekend, I'm having an abortion and I can't shake this feeling of dread that claws at my insides like a feral animal. I'm terrified, but not because of the procedure itself. No, it's the echoes of my choices reverberating through my mind that awaken the ghosts of my past. I'm already a mother, and the weight of that title can feel like an anchor dragging me down into a murky sea of desperation. The image of my daughter sleeping peacefully in her room, oblivious to the turmoil of emotions roiling within me, haunts me. I chose to keep her when I was 18. Fresh out of high school and bursting with dreams, only to find out that motherhood for me is more of a prison than a sanctuary. Each year has felt more like a countdown than a gift, the joy of her little milestones eclipsed by the crushing responsibilities that suffocate my spirit. My friends tell me I'm a good mom, but what they don't see is the way guilt gnaws at my insides, The way I can't shake off the feeling that I'm failing my daughter by merely existing as a shell of the woman I used to be. 3 weeks ago, the panic set in when I found out I was pregnant again. I remember the sharp gasp I took as the test turned from 2 lines to a burning reminder of my reality, my heart racing as if I could outrun the consequences. I keep replaying the moments that led me here, the temporary lapse in sanity that resulted in a life I didn't want. It was sloppy, reckless, and I knew deep down I needed to end it before the weights of another child anchored me even further into this despair. But even as I finalize the decision, an unsettling voice whispers in the corners of my mind, asking if I'm solely doing this for myself, which makes the guilt swirl more violently, especially when I picture my daughter's bright eyes lighting up at the idea of being a big sister. Rational thoughts twist grotesquely, becoming monstrous shapes that loom over me, a constant reminder that some women would kill for the chance to cradle another life. My heart races as I scroll through an abortive forum, the raw narratives of those taking the same plunge. I only find snippets of solace in comment threads, women sharing stories of fear, heartbreak, and liberation intertwined like a chaotic tapestry. But it doesn't ease the pang of loss. I feel like I'm stepping closer to a precipice with every passing day, and the edge beckons me with its dark allure. I spend the days leading up to the appointment trapped in my own head, oscillating between anxiety and resolve. I can hardly focus on anything at all. Lunches, laundry, school pickups, and for the first time, I find myself wishing the hours away, as though I can fast forward to an uncertain future because at least it signifies an end to this unbearable limbo. My mother's voice echoes whenever I dare to think about discussing my choice with her. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. Her judgment hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the memories of how she always seemed disappointed in my choices, so how could I possibly tell her this? It sends shudders down my spine, bringing the tight knot of fear back to my throat. The night before the procedure, I lay in bed, staring into the dark. It swirls with unfamiliar shapes and shadows that seem to mock me, whispering, "You are going to regret this." I check the time again, 3:02 a.m. I can't help but think about the what-ifs. What if I go through with it and regret it later? What if I somehow lose this child and never forgive myself? It's an agonizing loop that steals my sleep, and somehow, as I watch the dawn creep in through my window, I start to wish I had never seen that pregnancy test in the first place. I think perhaps it's the fact that I can feel the weight of other women's suffering echoing through me, and it's horrifying. The hours crawl, each tick of the clock feeling like a drumbeat in my chest, signaling my impending choice. The morning of the procedure blurs as I dress and collect my thoughts. However, just before my appointment, I receive a message from a friend, congratulatory and innocent. She doesn't know yet. "Hey! You should tell your daughter she's going to be a big sis." My heart lurches painfully at the thought. I want to scream and cry, to push away the looming fate that's just ahead, yet it only solidifies the fear that has grown thick and suffocating deep within me. When I finally arrive at the clinic, the fluorescent lights buzz overhead, blinding and sterile, and the waiting room is filled with a mix of tension, sadness, and an unsettling camaraderie, as if we're all private members of a club of despair, each woman clutching her heartache beneath the surface. I sit there, feeling disassociated as I stare at the posters on the wall promoting women's health. They seem so jovial, speaking of choice and empowerment, yet here I am, crushed beneath the weight of my own choices. When they finally call my name, I feel a wave of nausea wash over me, intertwined with a sense of inevitability, and as I move toward the narrow hallway, I can't help but wish more than anything for this opportunity to vanish and for me to be free of my own decisions. The doctor is kind but detached. She speaks in soothing tones that feel oddly clinical, and I keep reminding myself of the reasons I'm there, the relief I'll feel afterward. But amidst it all, in the sharp tang of antiseptic, my memories come alive, the sweet laugh of my daughter, the feel of her small hand gripping mine, the way she looks at me as if I am her entire world, and a sudden wave of panic hits me. What if this is my last chance? As the procedure begins and the world falls silent around me, I feel the terror building within. It's as though I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into an abyss where every failed option and unmade choice lie festering like wounds. And as I close my eyes, tears streaming down my cheeks, I try to remember why I'm here and breathe deeply into the fear, hoping that somewhere within this harrowing moment, amidst the chaos of the choices I've wrestled with, I can unearth the strength that has eluded me for so long before I plunge headlong into the darkness. It was a muggy Wednesday evening when I found it, tucked under a twisted patch of weeds near a lamppost, a neat, tightly bound stack of cash, crisp and untouched, totaling $800. My heart raced with exhilaration and guilt. What were the odds of encountering such a fortune just lying there? I looked around, half expecting someone to rush back for it, but the street was empty, save for a few stray cats scavenging the darkening alleyway. Lured by the promise of a small fortune and a fleeting belief that maybe, just maybe, this was some cosmic karma for my endless run of bad luck, I pocketed the money and hurried home, my mind racing through fantasies, new clothes, a weekend getaway. But when the euphoric thrill subsided, an unsettling thought began to creep in: who had lost this money, and why was it just sitting there? I pushed it aside, convinced it was my stroke of luck. That night, I fell asleep thinking I had scored, dreaming of countless possibilities, yet, the dreams twisted darker as the hours wore on. I woke up to find my room flooded with moonlight, shadows danced along the walls, and an unnerving sense of dread pooled in my gut, a feeling that I had crossed a line. Shaking it off, I spent the cash over the next few days, indulging in new sneakers, dinners out, and a vintage vinyl collection I'd coveted for ages, all the while ignoring the gnawing sensation like I was being watched. Then, on the third night after my little spree, a soft knock echoed from my front door, pulling me from sleep. Heart pounding in my chest, I peered through the peephole, but there was only darkness on the other side. I hesitated before finally opening it, and there was nothing. I rationalized it must have been the house settling, yet as I climbed back into bed, an unsettling chill ran through me. Nights turned into restless fever dreams, where shadows lurked, and I could hear whispers drifting through the walls as if the house itself carried secrets. I decided to go on a weekend camping trip to clear my head, hoping fresh air would wash away the anxiety, but instead, my unease morphed into paranoia. I kept feeling someone tailing me back to my tent, shadows flitting just beyond the glow of the campfire. On the night of my return, I found a note slipped under my door, a single line: "You shouldn't have kept what wasn't yours." Panic consumed me. I ripped it from the floor and scoured my apartment for hidden cameras or surveillance equipment, but nothing was amiss. I thought of going to the police, but part of me was terrified they'd see me as a thief. The feeling of dread clawed at me, and my dreams became nightmares of strangers with hollowed eyes and grins that shifted unnaturally. One evening, wrapped in my own self-imposed isolation, I decided to return to that lamppost where it all began, a futile act of atonement, an absurd gesture against an invisible foe. The street was eerily quiet, moonlight illuminating the cracked pavement, but when I reached that spot, my heart sank. The area was now barren, as if the ground itself had decided to swallow whatever remained of that hidden treasure. Suddenly, an icy breeze whipped around me, and from the shadows, I saw a figure emerge, stretched limbs, a pale face, and eyes that burned with a bright, unnatural light, locking onto mine with a grip of unimaginable terror, and it spoke in a voice laced with rage: "You took what was mine." I stumbled back, stumbling over my own feet as the realization hit me: this was no mere stalker or oppressor, it was something far worse, a spirit of vengeance awakened by my greed. I ran, my heart slamming against my ribs, but no matter how fast I sprinted, I could feel it gaining on me, colder air brushing against my neck like icy fingers. I burst into my home, slamming the door behind me, but the moment my back hit the wood, the lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. In that suffocating void, I could hear the soft thud of footsteps. "You're never alone," they seemed to whisper, and suddenly I realized those whispers weren't in my head, they echoed from beyond the walls, from the very depths of the house, spiraling around me like a distant echo of their grief. I ran for my phone to call for help, but as soon as I picked it up, a bone-chilling growl erupted from the corners of my apartment, making me drop it to the floor. The air turned thick with an angry energy, and out of desperation, I screamed, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Please, just leave me alone." Silence fell like a crushing weight, but the peace didn't last long. The lights burst back on, revealing my living room immersed in shadows stretching and writhing on the walls, and as I turned, there it was again, that wretched figure, now standing right behind me, a sinister smile splitting across its face. "It's too late for apologies. You shouldn't have kept what wasn't yours," it hissed, its breath cold as winter frost, and I felt my heart shatter. In an instant, the world faded to black, and when I opened my eyes, I was right back at that lamppost, but this time, I was staring down at my own lifeless form sprawled on the cracked pavement, as another wretch like me moved to gather the cash scattered beside my body. And in that moment, I understood, the cash was never meant for me, it was a curse, an anchor to drag the greedy into the abyss, and as my hollowed eyes looked back at the living world, I realized I was doomed to wander these silent streets, watching one unfortunate soul after another pick up that cursed money and spark the cycle of misery all over again. I never thought a simple doodle could turn my life upside down, But it all started that fateful Tuesday when the deadline for my marketing project loomed large and the stress made me feel like I was about to burst. It was a typical day at the office, the hum of fluorescent lights melding with the occasional clatter of keyboards, and I was desperately trying to seek a moment of relief from the pressure when I resorted to doodling on the back of a scrap sheet. Just mindless sketches at first, but I found my hand taking a mind of its own, the ink flowing freely until a crude image of a woman began to emerge, her voluptuous curves exaggerated to the point of absurdity, and before I knew it, I had created something that certainly crossed the line of professionalism. It was supposed to be a throwaway, an escape from the mundane, but somehow in my delirium, I thought it might be a hilarious prank to leave it in the bathroom for my co-workers to find. So, with a chuckle and a misplaced sense of bravado, I left the sketch taped near the mirror, knowing my colleagues would be amused, perhaps shocked, but definitely entertained. The toilet blobbed behind me as I walked back to my desk, a thrilling but irresponsible sense of rebellion flooding my veins. The day trudged on, filled with meetings and pressure, but then, as the clock struck 4, I heard an explosion of laughter from the bathroom. I felt a rush of vindication, it was a hit. But as I wrapped up my workday and headed home, my mind buzzing with excitement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The laughter felt wrong, ringing with a twisted edge, almost manic, echoing like it was too loud for just a few people. When I arrived home, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages from my coworkers flooded my screen, filled with emojis and jokes referencing the doodle. In one instant, I felt like a hero and a villain, but as the hours passed, I noticed something unsettling, a particular text from Dave, our office's mild-mannered IT guy. "You think this is funny? You better watch your back." I laughed it off, convincing myself that it was all in good fun, but deep down, the laughter from earlier replayed in my head, mulling over the twisted undertones that chilled me. That night, I dreamt of the doodle. It warped and morphed, the figure contorting in ways that made my skin crawl, and when I jolted awake at 3 a.m., soaked in a cold sweat, all I could feel was dread gnawing at my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling that the laughter hadn't been innocent, there was something sinister lurking behind it. I chalked it up to stress and decided to apologize to my team the next day, a simple acknowledgement of my poor judgment. However, as I walked into the office, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The usual banter was replaced by hushed whispers, glances thrown in my direction that melted into uncomfortable silence as I approached my desk. Dave was waiting for me, unusually calm with an unsettling grin plastered across his face, and every ounce of my previous bravado melted into cold fear. "You really think you're funny, don't you?" he said softly, but the words dripped with a venomous edge. I attempted to downplay the incident, but he lunged forward, placing a finger on my shoulder with a grip that felt like ice. "You've awakened something, don't you understand? That doodle, it wasn't just a joke, it was an invitation." His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, my laughter felt like a distant memory. The panicked feeling rose again, the kind that tells you something has gone horribly awry. A gnawing uncertainty fed by fragments of laughter echoed in my mind as I made my way to the bathroom, heart racing. When I swung the door open, I was met with an eerie silence, thick and oppressive. The mirror reflected the paper, now besmirched with something dark, blotches that appeared to grow like a virus, twisting and shifting the joyful cartoon into something grotesque. My heart sank as I recalled a fleeting thought, a split second of realization that what I drew had taken on a life of its own when the walls of laughter disappeared. My phone buzzed with another text from Dave, "You shouldn't have left it there." My blood ran cold, the laughter was now replaced with an airy ambience that felt like a predator breathing down my neck. I bolted from the bathroom and gathered my things, determination flooding my veins to get the hell out of there, but as I made my way to the exit, I was met with a blockade of coworkers, faces twisted in glee, eyes vacant, they weren't themselves anymore. Then I noticed a figure in the back, dark and looming, shrouded in shadows, where the light seemed to shut away. It grinned in a grotesque parody of laughter, a visage that echoed the thing I had drawn, long limbs sprawled and a wide mouth that split too far too wide, and as it stepped into the light, I saw the blend of my doodle and something grotesquely real. It was then I realized, horror seeping into my core, that they weren't just laughing at me, they were all a part of it now. Puppets danced to a tune I had unwittingly composed, and the line between my nightmare and reality had blurred. I dashed for the exit, my heart pounding in tandem with the ultimate realization. I had opened the door to madness, and no one, especially not my own hands, would keep the darkness at bay. I escaped into the murky embrace of night, never looking back until now, each sleepless night feeding into the whispers of my former co-workers, and though I've tried my best to just forget, Every corner I turn flickers with memories of laughter, and that suffocating shadow that stretches ever closer, hungry for a new doodle, a new invitation to join its sinister party. I didn't think it would come to this, but as I sit here on the stained carpet of my crumbling apartment, the bottle of cheap vodka cradled between my trembling hands, I realize I've surrendered to this disease, the one that lured me in like a siren's song, promising comfort but delivering chains of despair. I used to tell myself that drinking was just a way to cope with life's relentless cruelties, a temporary escape from the noise in my head, but those moments of solace slowly twisted into an insatiable craving, a hunger that gnawed at my sanity. Last night, I crawled my way home from the bar, bloodied knuckles from a fight I couldn't even remember and lips stained with the bitterness of whiskey, but all I clung to was the promise of forgetfulness, at least until the morning light shone through my window and the hangover hit like a freight train. I told myself I'd quit for good. I promised my mom, my sister, anyone who cared enough to listen, but the moment I put an empty glass down, another filled its place. The whispers in my mind grew louder, taunting me as each drink became a desperate attempt to silence them, drowning my regrets with every fiery swallow. Friends drifted away one by one, their concerned looks became too much to bear, and their voices, once warm, transformed into echoes of judgment that only compounded my loneliness. So, I pushed them out, barricaded myself within the four peeling walls of my existence, believing that the soul-crushing isolation would shield me from the world's cold regard. But the worst part of this descent was the reality that I found something oddly comforting in my self-imposed exile, the despair wrapped around me like an old, familiar blanket, soothing yet suffocating, crushing any flicker of hope that dared to ignite. I began having conversations with the shadows that danced in the corners of the room, companions born from the depths of my suffering, sharing secrets and laughter more genuine than any memory of my former life. They were my only friends in this hell I had chosen, and with them, I whispered my failings and fears, and they listened without judgment, no one but them to make me feel the weight of who I had become. Every drink became a ritual, and each evening found me nestled among the ghosts of my own making, telling them how easy it was to forget when the poison burned its way down my throat, how I could almost feel their ethereal hands pushing me away from the unforgiving realities of time and space, until all that was left was an empty room filled with echoes of who I once was. And then, the hallucinations started, a particularly vivid night when I swore that I could see my own mother standing in the kitchen, tears in her eyes, begging me to stop, to come back to the light, her voice fluttering around me like ash from a dying fire, pleading, but instead of reaching for her, I reached for the bottle, trying to drown her out. I let out a hollow laugh because how could I explain to her that the more I drank, the more of my past bled into the present, transforming my heart into a vessel of scars, a reminder that I had betrayed not only myself but those who truly loved me? I thought I could handle it, that I could embrace the darkness that wrapped around my soul, but with each sip, every drop pulled me deeper into a murky abyss where even hope had long ago drowned. There were nights I stumbled outside, the cold biting through my skin, asking whoever might listen for redemption, but I was met with nothing but shadows, the streetlights flickering like taunts above me, each wink a reminder of the life I had forfeited. It was then that I discovered the truth. I didn't just drown my pain in alcohol, I let it fester, transform into a morbid companion I could no longer distinguish from myself. When I finally hit rock bottom, the hazy morning I woke up alone, urine-soaked and shivering in a puddle of my own regrets, surrounded by bottles like sentinels guarding the last remnants of my soul, I realized that surrendering to alcoholism wasn't just about giving up on battling a vice, it was a willingness to accept the whisperings of the shadows, to invite them into the cracks of my being. I called out for help, but the silence that consumed me felt like an old friend that had known me longer than any human ever could. I surrendered, I gave in, I made peace with the demons that clutched at my edges, but in the depths of this acceptance lay something far more sinister than the mere act of pouring that first drink. It was the moment I understood that I wasn't just battling alcoholism, I was welcoming it, begging it to stay, because without it, I was just another lost soul wandering the earth, unseen, unworthy, and utterly alone. So here I sit, with the weight of my surrender pressing down, and I wonder not just how I got here, but what lies ahead now that I've truly given up, whether this will be the closing act of my twisted lullaby or the prelude to an even darker descent where others can only look on, horrified at my devotion to something so utterly destructive. And as I raise the bottle to my lips, a part of me hopes that perhaps it can hold the answers I so desperately seek, even if they are shrouded in sin and self-destruction, because surrendering to alcoholism feels like the ultimate betrayal, not just to those around me but to the very essence of who I once believed I could be. I have to tell you something that happened today, something I never thought would turn my entire life upside down in the span of just a few minutes. And believe me when I say it's going to sound insane, but I assure you it's true. Just 10 minutes ago, my dad found my pocket PC. Yeah, you heard that right, and let me explain before you judge, it's not what you think. I bought it a couple of weeks ago when I was feeling particularly lonely and curious about the whole thing, and I kept it hidden under a stack of old clothes in my closet, a place I thought was secure. Anyway, my dad, bless his heart, decided it was time to clean out the storage space in my room this morning. He's always been super practical, and he thinks that a clutter-free room equals a clutter-free mind. I was in the living room pretending to study because if I tried to stop him, I knew I'd have to admit I wasn't even working and that would mean more chores. So there I was, sweating bullets as I heard the telltale rustle of clothes being shifted around and then the unmistakable sound of plastic crinkling. That's when my heart started racing. It was only a matter of time before reality crashed down on me like an avalanche. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to remind him that sometimes it's better not to know, he wouldn't understand, or worse, he would judge me. But I just kept my mouth shut, too tortured by the anticipation. And then I heard it, the solid, resounding thump of the plastic hitting the floor. My stomach dropped, and I swear I could feel my heart pounding in my throat as the thought of him discovering it turned into a nightmare. I focused on the sound of the TV instead, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd dismiss it, thinking it was some weird toy or something left behind from when I was younger. But then, his footsteps started moving towards me, and my brain went into overdrive. Should I run? Should I pretend to be asleep? All I could think about was how he once told me that fathers should be a source of guidance and strength, not shame, but I felt so vulnerable at that moment. "Hey, come here for a second," he called out, his voice completely calm, and that only made my anxiety spike higher, wondering how on earth he could be so nonchalant about discovering his son's secret pleasure. I took a deep breath and stepped toward him, feeling like I was walking to my execution instead of just to the living room, and there he was, holding it in his massive hands like it was the strangest relic he'd ever found. "What's this?" he asked, and I could see it lying in the middle of the floor, glistening unnaturally yellow in the light, a horrifyingly intimate object that felt like a betrayal not just of my own privacy but of everything we'd ever shared. He didn't look angry, just bewildered, and I could only muster a weak, it's a toy." The embarrassment clawed at my throat, tightening like a noose as I tried to justify something that felt inherently unjustifiable. In that fleeting moment, all the thoughts of potential explanations ran through my mind. What would it even mean for him to know this side of me? But instead of outrage or disappointment, there was just this moment of awkward silence, a chasm opening between who I was, who I wanted to be, and who I knew he saw me as. "A toy for what?" he asked, eyes narrowing, not in judgment but in genuine confusion, and I swallowed hard, feeling the tears prick at the corners of my eyes as my body reacted to both shame and fear in their most primal forms. I was hyper-aware of everything around us, the old family photos watching silently from the wall, the clock ticking away the precious seconds, and the very air growing thick with unspilled feelings. You know, when you're alone." I blurted out, my heart racing as the words escaped my lips, and I watched as his mouth fell open slightly in shock, and then something shifted in his gaze, not anger or judgment, but a kind of understanding, perhaps even empathy. "You know, son," he said slowly, almost hesitantly, "everyone has their ways of coping. I wasn't always this old and wise." It felt like the ground shifted beneath my feet, some kind of twisted normalization of the situation as he recounted awkward tales from his own youth, stumbling through the clumsiness of his teenage years in a way that reflected a shared humanity between us. It was still so surreal for me, the notion that he could ever relate to my experience in that way, but it also left me feeling exposed, like the last vestiges of my privacy had been stripped away. "Just next time, keep it hidden better," he said, a half-smile tugging at his lips as I somehow felt a sense of belonging resurfacing despite the very awkwardness of the moment. It was bizarre, shooting back into my brain like a jolt of disbelief that this conversation could even be happening. But then, as the words hung between us and the initial shock wore off, I sensed an undeniable echo in the silence that loomed afterward, as though despite the understanding, a shadow had crept in, reminding me that not everything can be normalized. There's a fine line between acceptance and envision, and I couldn't shake the thought that something unspoken loomed overhead now, like a dark cloud. What else about me might he find if he kept digging? What else had I left behind in the nooks and crannies of my life that could compel him to look deeper? And just like that, my mind spiraled into the terrain of paranoia, nurturing the seeds of worry that despite the light-hearted banner, I could never completely escape the judgment, or worse, the betrayal lurking just beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. 10 minutes had changed everything, torn apart the fabric of a simple father-son relationship and opened up a chasm of uncertainty. And just when I thought that maybe we could laugh this off and go back to the usual domestic grind, I realized I didn't even know how to face him now. How to reconcile the intimacy of that moment with my own vulnerability, and as I turned to escape the heavy burden of the room, I was left with an echo of something deeper, an unsettling reminder that no matter how light he intended to make it, I'd never look at that pocket PC the same way again, or my dad, or any part of my life that, for the first time, seemed irrevocably intertwined with secrets I could never shake off, leaving me to wonder how many more hidden things lay dormant in my existence, waiting to be brought into the light, as everything I thought I knew began to unravel, one uncomfortable revelation at a time. For the past 6 months, I've been living off McDonald's triple cheeseburger meal, and every day blurs into the next like a greasy streak on a sun-drenched diner window. It began as a challenge I unveiled on a viral TikTok, a promise to consume nothing but the greasy, cheesy beast and record my physical and mental decline, but as my body deteriorated and my mind became a playground for manic thoughts, the thrill turned into something much more sinister than I had anticipated. At first, the meals came with sugary sodas and salty fries on plastic trays, a symphony of crunch and savor, but each week it became harder to face the mounting grease slip that coated my tongue, increasingly swapping the carefree banter of my followers for whispers of their concerns, yet I assured them it was all in the name of content, of viewing the physical manifestation of obsession. Ironically, my dwindling health forced me to expand from mere indulgence to watching myself descend into an obsession with not just the burgers, but the restaurant and what it may be hiding. I started noticing little things, the way the golden arches shimmered unnaturally in the streetlights at night, how the store looked almost too perfect, like a grotesque replica of American life caught in some insidious feedback loop, and I became determined to stay away from the light, visiting the drive-thru late at night under the vengeful gaze of the moon, where I could indulge without the eyes of the world upon me. I could taste the salt of paranoia creeping into my meals, every bite whispering old conspiracies about fast food chains keeping their customers numb and compliant, and on that fateful night, I decided to stay until closing time. I slipped into a booth with my mountains of meals, convinced I would capture the magic of my madness, but as the hours dragged on, the employees began acting odd, voices hushed, glancing my way constantly as if debating something unfathomable, the beeping of the fryers blending into an uncanny rhythm that echoed between the walls like a heartbeat, and then I saw it, through the back door that occasionally swung ajar. Ominous shadows moved, figures draped in black, their whispers piercing through the fog of my fries like daggers, and for a moment they faced me inside their hurried movements. The way they palmed something shiny turned my stomach with dread. I felt like a curious child deciding to stretch the boundaries of bedtime, ignoring the warning of unseen monsters looming behind the threshold of reason, but curiosity proved fatal when, emboldened by desperation and madness, I slipped out to see what twisted operation lay hidden from sight. Crouched behind a dumpster, I did my best to blend into the stale smell of old grease, and what I saw ripped away the sanity I had briefly held onto as employees gathered in an unnatural circle, hands reaching out, their voices a low raspy chant in unison as they cradled small, fleshy bags, and my heart thundered in my chest when one of them lifted it for the moon to illuminate. It wasn't food, it was something, dare I say, alive, squirming against the fabric like something you would see in the darkest corners of nightmares, and I realized with dawning horror that the fries I had eaten day after day, the burgers that fed my obsession, were somehow part of this absurd ritual, and when they lifted their heads and locked eyes with me, I felt the ice of dread seep into my veins, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, a mocking expression that soured into fear as weighty silence fell over them, and instead of running, I froze, spellbound by the absurdity before me. I couldn't flee because, in the back of my mind, I understood that I was more than a customer. I had become part of their cult-like existence, a node in the machine that allowed them to thrive as I descended into gluttony and degradation, each meal gnawing away at my humanity, and just as I turned to flee, a harsh spotlight swung my way, blinding me momentarily, and when my vision cleared, they had vanished, leaving nothing but the stillness of night and the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I sprinted back home, my mind racing with maddened thoughts of an unspeakable truth, convinced I had run from something that had marked me. But no matter how far I escaped physically, I felt its cold fingers creeping deeper into my soul, a lingering taste of burnt beef and stale fries staining my very being, and in the days that followed, my cravings intensified as gnawing hunger gnawed at me. Each night, I found myself returning inexorably to the drive-thru, powerless and willing to ignore the awakening primal dread clawing at my insides, believing maybe the only way to confront this horror was to embrace it. Every sip of soda tasted richer, Every burger slathered in too much grease and cheese felt like a bridge to a dark comfort zone, dragging me deeper into the cult of consumerism, a cyclone that held me hostage. And one night, the smell turned acrid as I pulled up, the familiar voices of the cashiers rang hollow, devoid of warmth or cheer, and when I placed my order, it became a mantra: 3 triple cheeseburger meals. Make it quick. But instead of the usual laughter that followed, silence swept over the restaurant, a veiling tension that sent shivers rippling across my skin. And then, as I bit into my burger, an unmistakable crunch echoed, followed by a soft thud. Chewing, I felt something distinctly different, and when I pulled away from the patty, I was met with a small, writhing mass, a tiny, squirming thing, alive and yet eerily familiar. My stomach dropped, a wave of horror cascading through me as reality smacked against the back of my head, and all I could think about was that I needed to get away. But instead, I found myself racing into the shadows once more, the identical drive-through looming like a monstrous maw, and in that agonizing moment, I realized this deep-rooted desire for meat and darkness, wasn't going to let me go, and no matter how hard I tried to tackle the insatiable hunger gnawing at my sanity, I was drawn back toward those cursed arches, the memories of my gluttony becoming the final course of this grotesque feast. As I step back into the evening gloom trying to grapple with what has transpired, I can't help but reflect in a haze of dread that what started as a challenge, a dive into dietary absurdity, has now morphed into some agonizing cycle of survival at the mercy of a nightmare disguised by neon lights. Weeks go by as my days become shadows inside this mask, the grease staining my thoughts, the beckoning of the drive-thru haunting my every step, until I'm no longer living for the content but rather for every bite that echoes through the night, the truth coiling around me tighter than before. I am more than a man in a fast food frenzy, I'm becoming one of them, and as I catch my reflection in the window's sheen, the monster devouring what's left of me, I can only whisper, next time. Hoping I don't lose my soul to another late-night cravings. It started with one night of reckless abandon, the kind of night that felt like a neon-lit fever dream, where reality twisted into a blurry mess of laughter and intoxication. I didn't even know her name when we stumbled into my apartment, the air thick with vulnerability and bravado, as we shed our inhibitions along with our clothes. We both knew where it was headed, the magnetic pull of primal instincts overshadowing even the smallest shred of common sense, and when the early morning sunlight began to creep through my window, leaving taco trucks and late-night bars in the rearview mirror, I fully expected that would be the last I'd ever see of her, but then I received a text 3 weeks later that turned my life into a waking nightmare. "I'm pregnant," it read, and even though I had never met a baby trapped, the world pressed in on me so hard that I could hear my heartbeat ricocheting off the walls like a frantic pinball. For a moment, my mind went blank, the panic a tight coil in my chest. I was 26, fresh out of grad school, working a dead-end job in a coffee shop, living with my parents while trying to pay off student loans. I had neither the time nor the resources to welcome new life into such chaos. I tried to reach for rationality, for a way out, but my bravado slipped away like water through seeping cracks, and all I could feel was the suffocating weight of impending responsibility. We met that weekend in a diner, with its flickering neon lights and greasy menus that felt like a cruel joke, as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I realized she was just as lost as I was. We spent hours fumbling through awkward conversations and half-hearted jokes, but the laughter couldn't cut through the thick fog of anxiety that hung over us, and when she finally said she was thinking of keeping it, my heart collapsed under the weight of dread. Images of sleepless nights, baby cries, and shattered dreams flooded my mind. The thought of us felt like a ghost trapping me, suffocating any chance of freedom or happiness, manifesting a deeper panic. In a moment of desperation, I suggested she consider other options, words woven together with fear and desperation that sent a chill through the diner, mingling with the greasy scent of fries. She left in tears, and I felt a pang of guilt mixed with relief as we went our separate ways, her not knowing where I had just trapped myself, lost in the shadows, resonating echoes of my own decisions haunting me. The next few weeks were a blur of manic existence, trying to avoid her calls, dodging text messages, and deceiving myself into thinking that maybe, just maybe, I could live this life unscathed, like running from a nightmare that kept unfurling in the recesses of my mind. But it didn't stop. Out of nowhere, I grew sick during the nights, not from the anxiety of what awaited but from something deeper and darker, a sensation that felt more like a presence, tightening around my throat like a slow strangulation, and when I finally sought help, the doctor looked into my eyes and said, "There's nothing physically wrong, but maybe you're just stressed out." And so the weeks dragged on, with my existence narrowing into the oddly cozy confines of my own panic, watching shadows dance on the walls, feeling like a prisoner in my own skin, as I realized I was disappearing, fading with each yawn, each ounce of energy slipping away like dust in the wind, reducing me to nothing more than a wisp, a ghost of who I once was. The night I changed felt particularly vivid. I looked in the mirror and saw it, the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes staring back at me, but now it wasn't just a reflection, it was as if someone else was staring back, a stranger peering from behind the glass, and I barely registered the pounding on my door until it shattered my trance. Before I could react, before the panic could turn into a response, a violent crash sent splinters across the floor, and there she was, the girl from that fateful night, her face twisted in anger and desperation, red and raw like she had clawed her way through a thorny bush. "I needed to tell you," she gasped, and before she could complete her thought, a shudder crawled down my spine, and I knew she wasn't alone. I was swallowed by darkness, the door collapsing, pushed aside, and there it was, the presence I had suffocated beneath my panicked thoughts, standing behind her, an amalgamation of shadow and texture, as if distorted memories rolled into one sepulchral being, and I realized too late that it wasn't just my fear manifesting. As the silhouette expanded like smoke curling into the room, it filled the space with an icy dread radiating from nowhere and everywhere, echoing like a forgotten despair, and a frantic energy surged within me to run, but my legs felt like concrete. It was a horrifying truth, I was trapped within my own demise, like I had become both the phantasm and the prisoner, witnessing my life slip away as if I were spectating in a theater of the damned. "What's happening?" she screamed, while a light trembled against the onslaught of shadows, and I wanted to shout, to tell her to run, but my voice was lost between realms, trapped like I was, fated and fating. I watched helplessly as the creature reached for her, the rejection of destiny played out in Casablanca tones, fear brewing as she shrieked, and the last visible remnants of life I possessed swirled into the abyss, where the lines of mortality and spirit blurred. I felt it in that moment, the truth that settled in, that I had strived to escape and now welcomed with open arms, a realization that I had become truly a ghost, wandering the earth, forever shackled by my own choices, encircled by my demons while the living blinked and danced around me, unaware that I could only watch, freezing in horror as life unfolded without me, trapped not by a baby, but by the weight of my own regrets as I drifted along the edges of darkness. It was supposed to be a quick pit stop on the way home from work, just a simple bathroom break at the rundown gas station off the interstate that looked like it had seen better days. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by a nauseating combination of stale air and something surprisingly more sickening, like a combination of mildew and regret. I grimaced but was desperate enough to let it slide as I approached the stall, the ancient, metal door creaking ominously as I pushed it open. That's when an impulsive sense of rebellion seized me, a ridiculous notion that perhaps the universe needed a reminder of my existence in that small, filthy space. I took out my phone to film a silly moment for my friends, maybe a playful rant about the horror of public bathrooms, but a flicker of mischief surged through me as I glanced at the grimy walls, layered with graffiti and obscenities. In that split second, the idea twisted into something darker, the type of idea that snakes into your brain and refuses to slither away. Before I knew it, I was kicking the toilet paper dispenser off the wall with a satisfying crash, its contents spilling all over the floor as if the universe had decided to shower me in white chaos. Part of me stepped back, eyes bulging at my own audacity, only to be followed by another wave of absurdity as I ripped down the faded posters, letting them flutter to the ground like autumn leaves, their peeling edges catching the dim light. Something primal awakened. I was now an artist in destruction, crafting a masterpiece of nonsense, and with each action, I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins, pushing me towards a crescendo of insanity. But just as I grabbed the nearest stall door and wrenched it off its hinges, the realization of my impending doom crashed over me. I could hear footsteps approaching, the booming echo of someone else stepping into that hellish sanctuary, and suddenly, panic jolted me back to reality, forcing me into survival mode. I made a split-second decision to bolt from the stall and make a run for it, my heart pounding in a chaotic rhythm as I darted past the wreckage I'd created, the tips of my fingers brushing against the grimy walls as I maneuvered back through the doorway. The bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I hit the exit, the heavy air pressing hard against my lungs, and just as I stepped outside, I heard it, a blood-curdling scream snapping the silence, shrill and piercing. "Oh my God!" a stranger shouted, shock wrapping around their words like a tight noose, and my gut churned. I hesitated, dread pulled in my stomach as the reality of what I had done crashed down on me like a tidal wave. Curiosity tugged at me, urging my feet to turn back towards the wretched bathroom, but a raw instinct for self-preservation took over, and I sprinted towards my car, fumbling with my keys. Heart racing, I glanced back and caught a glimpse of horror etched on the stranger's face, their hands covering their mouth as they pointed towards the bathroom, their shocked expression meeting mine in that fleeting moment. The shade of dread that filled their eyes magnified the gravity of my actions, transforming my reckless abandon into a vivid, cautionary tale. Fueled by adrenaline, I barely noticed the flakes of something thick. Was it blood? Sticking to my shoes as I threw myself into the driver's seat, my heart pounding like a desperate drum in my chest. I slammed the door shut, cranking the ignition like it was my lifeline. As I pulled away from that gas station, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the figure stepping cautiously out of the bathroom, their body rigid with fear, frozen in place, as if I had awakened something I couldn't even comprehend. Were my actions truly meaningless, just a childish prank gone out of control? Or had I unwittingly opened a door to a world that thrived on chaos and horror, something that lurked beyond comprehension? I shook my head violently, willing the absurdity to fade, but a thought gnawed at me: what had I really done in that derelict bathroom? As the road ahead blurred, I drove faster, desperate to put miles between me and the chaos, replaying the scene over and over, wondering if it had all been an elaborate dream or a twisted premonition. I couldn't shake the sinking suspicion that the bathroom held more than just the grime I had torn apart. It felt like it had absorbed something sinister, something that would soon reveal itself. I fought back tears as I turned up the music, craving a distraction from the horror that awaited and from that lingering scream echoing in my ears. But as I sped down the desolate highway, the gas station flickering into the darkness of my past, a realization gripped me tightly, cold and haunting. That scream hadn't just been a reaction, it had been a summons, a call to something darker that now lingered in the air, waiting for me to return and complete the story I had started. The night I decided to tell my Uber driver I was pregnant was one of the coldest in November, the kind of bitter chill that slices through skin and settles in your bones, and I had just left a disastrous party, surrounded by strangers whose laughter felt like needles in my chest. The bright, glaring neon signs of the city blurred past in a haze, and I could feel the weight of my phone against my thigh, the app open, a countdown to an arrival I desperately needed. It was stupid, really. I rarely took Ubers, usually opting for the bus, but that night I wanted to escape the shattering silence of my empty apartment and the nagging voice in my head that reminded me how deeply alone I was. As I entered the car, a heavy-set man with a scraggly beard driving a weathered Hyundai nodded at me in the rearview mirror, and I offered a half-hearted smile, unsure how to fill the awkward silence. I thought about the ways I could initiate some small talk, maybe ask him about his night or comment on the weather, but instead, something snapped within me, fueled by the desperation and urge to be seen. "I'm pregnant, you know," I blurted out, and as the words tumbled from my lips, I marveled at my own audacity. There was a stunned pause before I heard him inhale sharply, and then, to my shock, he responded with genuine concern, eyes darting to the mirror as if to assess my condition. The conversation flowed easily after that, infused with questions about how far along I was and whether or not I was feeling okay. It felt strangely freeing to lie, to pretend for just a moment that I was cradling a life inside me, and the more we talked, the more my heart raced, not with fear, but exhilaration. My Uber rating spiked immediately after, and I found myself caught in a strange loop where my status, my worth, apparently hinged on the validation of strangers in this makeshift world. This fictitious pregnancy morphed into a shield, an anchor that allowed me to navigate through the unpredictable terrain of each car ride and these transient connections. I began sharing the tale, a little more embellishment here, a minor detail there each time, the fibs growing from a simple phase into a fleshed-out story of hope and impending joy. I became someone new in those rides, a mother-to-be navigating the treacherous waters of life in the city, and the drivers, such lonely souls in their own right, became confidants, eager to share advice, their own stories intertwined with mine. One night, a driver named Amir, who talked about his own children, exchanged numbers with me, suggesting I meet him and his family, and despite the unease that flared in my chest when the thought of it crossed my mind, I agreed. He was kind, I reasoned, and maybe that kindness wasn't so hard to accept, after all. After 3 months of this spinning web of lies, I was suddenly tangled in something more than just a harmless ruse. I was developing relationships, gathering friends, people who saw me as someone I wasn't, but desperately wanted to be. However, the truth of it burrowed under my skin, gnawing at me like a persistent itch I could never reach. I had created something fragile and meaningful through fragile, borrowed stories. But then came that one ride, the last endeavor in my facade, when I claimed to be headed to a high-risk ultrasound while trying to gather the courage to finally confess that I had been lying all along, and I was greeted by a woman in the driver's seat, Her name was Lily. We exchanged pleasantries, and something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, caught me off guard. As our conversation flowed, she sounded alarmingly familiar, recounting her own pregnancy, her highs and fears as a soon-to-be mother, and the weight of her truth connected to mine unraveled tighter. I could feel the knot in my throat tightening, and when I fumbled to keep the lie afloat, the words twisted into painful knots, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, her expression shifted. There was pain there, raw and deep, layered with grief that spoke volumes far exceeding what I could clearly interpret. "You don't have to lie to me, you know. I can tell when someone pretends," she said, her voice low and soft, like rippling water disturbed by a stone, and the impact crushed me in that moment. I felt exposed, stripped bare in a way I hadn't anticipated. She spoke of loss, of hope, each word heavy with unrelenting honesty that bore into my soul, and in that tight silence, the facade shattered beneath the weight of reality, revealing me not as the courageous mother, but as the frightened woman grasping at darkness. My fingers trembled, and I couldn't breathe, realizing I had encapsulated the struggles of so many into my own fragile narrative, and that one lie had led me down this spiraling path of something so much larger than I had ever anticipated. I rushed home, realizing with each mile that truly connecting with people, their grief, hopes, and dreams, had become the balm to my own loneliness, though born through deception. I began deleting my ride history, blocking numbers, curating my reality in bits and pieces, suffering the guilt of keeping everyone in the dark. But in my desperate quest for belonging, I had unwittingly discovered a fragile thread connecting us all within our shared human experiences. I realized it was time to confront the truth I had hidden from myself, that I wasn't unworthy of relationships without the facade, I had simply been afraid. But as the autumn leaves whirled down around me, I felt the shadows stretch long and heavy, whispering doubts about what was real and what had unraveled. The recasting of my identity clung uncomfortably, and I feared it was too late to salvage the remnants left in the wake of my deceit. In my attempts to find connection, I had instead spun a web of isolation, and as I stared at the night sky, their stars glimmering like distant dreams, I clung to one final hope, that perhaps, just perhaps, somewhere between the truth and the lie, I might finally find myself again. For weeks, I had watched Greg, our flashy co-worker, slip into the dimly lit bathroom beneath the fluorescent buzz of the office lights, only to emerge moments later, his demeanor disheveled, and his eyes glazed over, a shadow of their former self. It started when I overheard him mumbling to himself during a meeting, and while I brushed it off at first, the unsettling scent of stale cigarettes and something sweetly sickly wafting through the air during our lunch breaks couldn't be ignored, and with each passing day, my concern morphed into a gnawing suspicion that he was drowning his anxiety in more than just caffeine, leading me to one fateful day when the stress of deadlines and uncomfortable interactions coalesced into a moment of reckless courage, pushing me to scribble a note that ominously read, "I saw Greg snorting Xanax in the bathroom and leaving it on my boss's computer," the thrill of uncertainty mingling with guilt as I left the office for the day, convinced that I was doing the right thing, protecting my colleagues and preserving the office's integrity. The following morning, I returned to a charged atmosphere, whispers electrifying the air, and the uneasy tension in the break room made me feel as if everyone's eyes were drawn to me, yet paradoxically, none of them seemed to notice the absence of Greg, who was unceremoniously terminated last night, or so I was told. The details were murky at best, but it became painfully evident that the note had reached the right hands and precipitated a swift downfall, his pathetic excuse for an explanation lost between hushed giggles and nervous glances among my co-workers, their laughter sharp enough to cut through my anxiety. And still I couldn't shake the feeling that I had triggered something much darker than I intended. As I replayed my decision over and over in my mind like a haunting melody, what if Greg wasn't just snorting Xanax? What if it was worse? The tremors of guilt knotted my insides, turning the office into a stage set for a terrible crime, and that sense was only deepened when I witnessed Lisa, his closest confidant, her face pale, almost as if the very essence of joy had leaked out of her during the chaos, approached me in the copy room. Her eyes wide with sleepless fright, she lowered her voice, the tremor in her hands shaking the paper she clutched, a half-written apology to Greg scrawled in a hurried script. "You shouldn't have done this," she whispered, leaving me cold, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears as I questioned her allegiance and intentions, each word wrapping itself around my mind like a noose. Days turned into nights, and while the office buzz continued, Greg's absence grew heavier, thicker, like a fog strangling the very air, and at noon, I noticed Lisa arguing with her boss in hushed, frantic whispers, pointing fingers with expressions that mirrored horror more than anger, but it was her expression that struck a chord in my gut, the real fear radiating off. of her like heat from a fire. Something elsewhere in our building had gone off course, and even though pieces of the puzzle scattered across my mind didn't seem to form a picture, they would remain there, spiraling into dark thoughts until the day I got home and found a mangled note slipped through my door saying, "You have no idea what you've done," scrawled in Greg's handwriting. My heart fell, terror and regret intertwined like roots from a twisted, ancient tree, and as night fell and sleep evaded me, I stared at the ceiling wondering who else had known, who else had seen Mark's deepening darkness in the bathroom. The whispers to each other now morphing into something sinister, paranoia locking doors inside my mind. Then driving out to find comfort in any possible way, I found myself reaching out to a friend, only to realize the stakes were far too high. The entanglement of betrayal and ignorance stretched infinitely. Every phone call seemed compromised, every interaction tinged with a silent undertow of danger, and reality itself began to feel skewed, a mirage flickering at the corners of my vision. Before you know it, I was awake every night, the insidious thoughts taking root, convinced that Greg was watching me, a specter haunting my cubicle, lying in wait for the perfect opportunity to strike back, twisting the narrative so skillfully that even I doubted my own intentions, once so solid, now drowned in uncertainty. And then, one fateful evening, as I departed late from the office in a haze of fatigue, I felt the prickle of eyes on my back, a familiar shiver that sent shudders through my body, making my dinner lurch, only to find Greg standing in the shadows between cars, a smirk twisting his lips, hidden beneath the fluorescent glow of the streetlights, his presence slithering into my nightmares. "You think you can ruin me?" he whispered, stepping into the light just enough for me to see the depthless darkness behind his eyes, and it was in that moment, dear reader, that I felt the cold hand of regret wrap around my throat, because I had thought I had done something good when, in reality, I had unleashed a storm I would never survive. And now, all I can say is that if you ever feel compelled to right a wrong, just remember, the consequences might not just come for you, but for everyone you love, and sometimes the monsters you create are far worse than the ones you thought you were saving others from. When I was a teenager, I stumbled into the world of chat lines, those late-night calls where strangers shared their darkest secrets and desires, a playground of anonymity where I could pretend to be anyone I wanted. I even played the role of an underage girl, feigning innocence, letting the sounds of men's voices wash over me, enticing whispers that pulled me into a web of deception I thought I could control. But it got out of hand one fateful night when I found myself on the line with a man whose voice dripped with unsettling charm. Claiming to be a fatherly figure who understood my struggles, I caught a thrill when he said he could save me from my lonely existence. An odd sense of comfort wrapped itself around me as I played along, feeding him bits of my fabricated life while ignoring the red flags waving frantically in the back of my mind. He wanted to meet, and with each escalating thrill, a twist pulled tighter in my gut, a sensation I ignored as I stirred deeper into this dark fantasy, thinking I was just playing a game. But I agreed, my heart pounding, and not just from thrill but terror that began to stir when he told me he knew where I lived. I laughed it off, insisting he was bluffing, but he calmly replied, "You think I can't find you? Just keep talking, and I'll show you what I can do." And with that, the playful charade turned sinister, twisting my thoughts, burying my bravado under the weight of an undeniable fear that blossomed like a dark flower, blackening the innocence I thought I was preserving, recalling every creepy detail from the stories I'd heard about girls who foolishly put themselves in harm's way. The clock ticked, my heart raced, and I began to question every choice I had ever made in my reckless pursuit of attention. I said nothing, becoming a silent statue on the line, waiting for his voice to call again, praying this was all a sick joke, but returning calls echoed against the walls of my mind, escalating the dread I felt. Out of desperation, I hung up and buried myself in distraction, scrolling through social media, hoping to shove this experience into a far corner of my mind, telling myself I was safe, I was clever. But days turned into weeks and that thrill turned into a haunting echo that deepened my growing sense of paranoia. Then, one ominous evening as I walked home from my friend's house, feeling the chill of dusk settling in, I heard it, the low inflection of a voice crackling through the air, murky and familiar, causing an icy shiver that crawled through my spine, making every hair on my body stand at attention. It mirrored the tones of my late-night conversations, threading its way through the dark like a living shadow chasing me. I turned to find nothing but an empty street, until I saw it, a figure lurking at a distance, draped in the twilight shadows. The heart in my chest thudded violently as the reality of just how vulnerable I had made myself settled in. That feeling of being followed clamped down on me tight as I tried to convince myself I was simply being foolish, but I couldn't shake the urge to turn around, to observe as I began walking briskly, my instincts screaming at me to run. When I reached my doorstep, I slammed the door shut, leaned against it, gasping for breath, and the brief sense of security washed over me, yet I couldn't calm the raging storm inside. My cell phone buzzed unexpectedly in my pocket, and when I fished it out, there it was, a message from a blocked number reading simply, "You shouldn't play games you can't win," and in that moment, the laughter of my youthful naivety turned to ash in my mouth as pure dread settled over me, swirling into my consciousness. I realized how foolish I was to think I could dance on the edge without ever falling, and with trembling hands, I deleted my account and swore never to return to those lines again. But what I thought was the end of this dark chapter was just the beginning, because the next morning, the familiar creep of dread sank its claws deeper into my gut when I found handwritten notes slipped under my door, with details only I would know, recounting snippets of my life that should have remained private, my school, my friends, the secrets I shared with no one. The notes continued for weeks, growing more intense, more threatening, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was the product of overactive imagination, my gut growled with a chilling certainty that someone was watching, waiting, calculating. I turned to the police, who looked at me as if I were just another teenager seeking attention, and despair enveloped me until one night, I finally snapped. I decided to confront my shadow. I sent a text from a fake number, filled with passive aggression, taunting this phantom that haunted my steps, asking who they were, as if I could somehow lure a response and unveil my stalker's identity. It worked, fueling the fire inside the heart of this unknown monster, because within hours I received a reply, chilling yet captivating, a single word, "soon," and in an instant, a sizzling temperature ignited in my chest, coursing through my veins, fear morphing into an insatiable thrill. I stood outside on my porch, dialed the chat line number 1 last time, my breath hitching as the call connected, and while my pulse raced in excitement, the voice that slithered through the phone sent shivers down my spine. It was him, the man I had spoken to all those years ago, and he asked me if I had enjoyed our little game, if I liked the new rules. I didn't know if this was a nightmare or if I was going completely insane, but when faced with the cold reality that the monster I had invited into my life was very real and breathing just outside my window, each breath pressed against my throat, a new level of terror emerged within me, blending seamlessly into the darkness of the laugh echoing back at me through the receiver. A sound so utterly bone-chilling that I realized too late, some games can indeed be played to the end, but the stakes may be far more than you bargained for, each turn pushing the boundaries of survival and sanity at the same time, casting shadows where once there had only been a fleeting thrill. Only for me to discover that the deeper you dive into someone else's darkness, the more your own shadows come to haunt you. I have major daddy issues that molded me into who I am today, and it all started the summer I turned 11. That's when my father, a jovial man with a bellowing laugh and an unapologetically booming personality, vanished from my life without warning, leaving only a note that felt more like a sinister riddle than a farewell: "Find me in the shadows." My mother, fragile and devoid of her former brightness, became a ghost in our house, her silence speaking volumes about her heartbreak and my insatiable curiosity. I spent the next few weeks searching for answers in every crevice of our old Victorian home, the attic where I discovered a wrapped shoebox filled with my father's belongings, Polaroids of him with strangers, cryptic letters, and a worn-out pocket watch that ticked off the seconds like they were taunting my insecurities. It felt as if those remnants had been imbued with an aura of guilt and dread. I convinced myself that he wasn't dead but rather lost among the shadows, waiting for the day I would find him. I grew up chasing ghosts, eyes darting down dark alleys and desolate corners where light barely touched, certain that if I just looked hard enough, I'd uncover the truth behind his departure. Each failed attempt deepened the wound, and as adolescence hit me hard with a rush of insecurities, I turned to unhealthy relationships, starving for validation wherever I could find it. The first boy who told me I was beautiful became my world, but when he ghosted me like my father had, I hollowed out even further, my heart breaking each time another guy tried to earn my trust only to shatter it like fine porcelain. The summer after high school ended, as I was desperately trying to forge a new identity from the shards of my past, I made a pact with a friend to attend a party at an abandoned warehouse, where the rumor was that ghosts lingered, the kind that spoke of lost loves and unresolved familial issues. I brushed off the idea as ridiculous, but with a drink in my hand and traces of freedom on my lips, I followed a group into those hallowed halls where the music pulsed like a living entity, and the air throbbed with unexplainable tension. It was there, beneath flickering lights and haunting whispers, that I met him, a charismatic stranger who seemed to see straight into my fractured soul. He introduced himself simply as Jake, with eyes that glinted with a familiar mischief, his smile laced with secrets that drew me in like a moth to flame. He never asked about my past, instead, he listened to my nightmarish stories as if he were savoring each word, pulling me deeper into an intoxicating spiral of laughter and shared secrets. Yet, the more I opened up about my father's disappearance, the more Jake seemed unsettled, his gaze flitting to the darkness just beyond the reach of light. One night, while we wandered through abandoned neighborhoods, I impulsively suggested we hunt for ghosts, half seriously hoping to catch a glimpse of my dad. Jake smiled, albeit with a tinge of hesitation, and led me to a desolate park where the moon cast eerie shadows among the trees, the chilling silence blanketing us like an ominous presence waiting to be awakened. As Jake recounted tales of lost spirits, I felt an unexpected surge of hope, convinced that this would be the night I'd confront my past and find my dad. Hours slipped away like sand through our fingers, and just as the clock struck midnight, the air turned ice cold. The dark branches seemed to sway like skeletal fingers beckoning us closer, and for the first time, I felt the weight of expectation on my shoulders. "What if he's right there, watching you?" Jake whispered, his voice sending shivers down my spine. I spun around, half expecting my father to emerge from the shadows, but instead, it was a spectral vision, my father, looking every bit the same as I remembered, except his empty eyes were now gunmetal gray, filled with a mix of meaning and torment. I trembled, my heart pounding against my ribs as I reached out for him, but the air around me thickened with an unfathomable dread. Jake's expression shifted from admiration to fear, and before I could comprehend what was happening, he screamed for me to run. I felt the darkness surge, twisting and pulling at my sanity, and I bolted back through the park while the looming figure of my father faded further into the shadows, an unfulfilled promise lingering in the air. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a pit of despair, questioning everything and everyone. Jake, who had seemed to understand me so well, became another ghost. It was only later, when I came across the very pocket watch from the attic at a garage sale, that the horror unfolded. Its broken chime rang through my mind as if awakening memories buried deep. Every tick became a reminder of my father's absence, dragging forth the realization that the truth lay not in the shadows of my childhood but in the reflection of the man I had compromised myself to be. I never saw Jake again, not in this world or the next, but his words echoed in my mind like a haunting whisper, reminding me that my daddy issues were not just about abandonment, they were about the shadows I carried, shaping me into someone who searched for love in all the wrong places. It's been years, but I'm still haunted, forever trapped in a cycle of seeking those familiar patterns, the echoes of my father's laughter, and the lingering question, will I ever be enough for someone to stay? I never thought putting itching powder in my roommate's fleshlight would lead to anything more than a harmless prank, but I should have known better, the moment I ripped open that Ziploc bag and sprinkled the powder into the soft, inviting interior. A sense of dread wriggled through me like a dormant cockroach waking up under the fridge. My roommate, Jordan, was one of those guys with a twisted sense of humor. Hell, I should have expected some kind of retaliation, but when you're in college, it's all about pushing boundaries, and boy, did I push it this time. The plan was simple, let him discover the powder mid-pleasure so we could both have a good laugh at how ridiculous he'd be scrambling for relief, but that evening as I watched him enter his room, I felt a twinge of guilt pull at my stomach. That guilt didn't last long. The next day, as I lounged on the couch, the sound of Jordan's frantic banging on the bathroom walls echoed through our apartment. "Derek, you've got to help me. Something's wrong." Panic rippled through my veins, knitting a frown onto my face. I couldn't help but laugh. The thought of him struggling with the itching powder made me feel like a mischievous god. I sauntered over, peering through the bathroom door, and there he was, bathed in a sheen of sweat, his eyes wild with a desperation I'd never seen before. "It burns, man. It's burning," he yelled, and at that moment I realized he wasn't joking. This was something more than just a prank gone too far. A sense of foreboding landed heavy on my shoulders as he slammed the door open, nearly knocking me backward. The horror on his face was tangible, raw, no joke about it. "I can't take it. It's everywhere." His skin was flushed and blotchy, and I couldn't help but entertain the question of how he must have used that fleshlight to be so utterly consumed by a minor prank. It should have ended there, should have been dismissed as harmless fun, but soon enough, the laughter turned hollow as Jordan's fingers began to twitch, his body radiating an alarming frenzy. He paced the room, murmuring incoherently about something that wasn't right. Hours passed and the itching didn't stop, it only morphed into crawling sensations, like tiny ants racing under his skin. I realized this wasn't sheer mischief anymore, it felt darker, more sinister, like I had unleashed something I couldn't contain. "Derek, I need to go to the hospital," he blurted out, panic-stricken. Something deep inside warned me not to let him leave. I knew if he did, he might trace it back to me and punish me in ways I couldn't fathom. Instead, I pried open the creaky door and begged him to wait, to let me figure it out, so he wouldn't freak out even more, but everything I suggested was met with wild-eyed skepticism. I rummaged through my mind for any knowledge on remedies, scouring my memory for the slightest hint of what might help. Finally, I suggested a cold shower, anything to numb the incessant sensation. The moment he stepped into that icy cascade, I prayed it was the miracle cure, but then I heard his screams, unearthly shrieks of terror that pierced the walls, reverberating like those screams I had read about in horror stories. I rushed to the bathroom, and when I opened the door, a nightmarish sight awaited me: Jordan, half crouched on the shower floor, scratching frantically at his skin, his nails drawing red welts like brushstrokes on a canvas. "It won't stop!" he howled, and that's when I saw it, a dreadful sight: thin, black veins webbing across his arms, pulsing and thumping like they had lives of their own, almost as if the powder had consumed him, had burrowed into his body. I staggered back, horrified at the transformation happening before my very eyes, and he locked his gaze on me, a gaze that sent chills racing down my spine. "I can feel it in my veins, Derek. Something's waking up inside me." I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was just going overboard with a prank gone wrong, but I couldn't. I stood there, frozen in place, as he backed away slowly, the last glimmer of humor extinguished, leaving only fear and regret. With every trembling breath, I stumbled back, his cries mingling with the frantic water cascading down the shower walls, each drop echoing doom. I had done this, my prank had taken on a life of its own, as if the universe had conspired against me for my carelessness. I quickly fled the bathroom, panic coursing through me, colliding with the nauseating reality that I was responsible for unleashing something dreadful onto my roommate. "You have to help me," he cried, but how could I? What could I possibly do? It felt like I was playing with fire and now it was spreading beyond my reach. I raced to my room, locking the door behind me, my heart thundering in my chest as I replayed the events that had spiraled out of control. Night fell, and the darkness hugged my nerves tightly, sitting heavy like a thick cloak. Through the walls, I could hear Jordan, howling as if in the grip of some unseen torment. Each cry was a knife to my conscience, a reminder of the cruel seeds I had sown. The scratching sounds grew louder, punctuated by the sickening squelch of someone, trapped in agony beyond my doorway. In that moment, I decided I had to finish this. I had to turn back time and unearth a solution like a bolt of lightning cracking the sky open. But as I gathered my courage and stepped from my room, the second I glanced down the hallway, I froze. The bathroom door stood ajar, and though I willed myself to move forward, I was paralyzed, racked with the chilling thought that whatever I expected to find, it was beyond anything my imagination could conjure. As I slowly approached the bathroom, the air clawed at my throat, hanging heavy with tension. Each creak of the floorboards beneath me echoed ominously. I peered around the corner, and when I did, my stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. The shower still ran, windows fogged with steam. But it was far too quiet now. An uneasy silence danced in the air, and there, in the middle of the shower, I saw Jordan's reflection staring back at me, only it wasn't his face anymore, it had twisted into something grotesque and chilling. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken into his skull, and where the veins had once pulsed now writhed black tendrils that seemed to stretch out, scratching at the porcelain like spiders. "Derek," he murmured, but it wasn't his voice, it was something deeper, a haunting, echoing call that made my insides churn. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but I stood glued to the spot, and when it hit me, what I had awakened inside him, the reality crushed me like a wave crashing against the shore. "Get out!" he wailed, and in that moment, a surge of unbearable pain shot through the air, carrying with it the weight of my regret. I turned and ran for my life, ignoring the way fear clenched at my chest, fueling every step out of that apartment, knowing I might have released something far worse than a mere prank, and someone else would have to deal with what I had done. As I fled into the night, I couldn't shake the whispering doubt that somewhere in the darkness, Jordan was no longer just my roommate, he was something I could never fully understand, a horror born of my own making, and I knew there was no escaping the consequences of the itch I had awakened. As a kid, I always loved my little brother, Ben, more than anything else in the world. He had this sweet, innocent smile and a giggle that could light up a dark room, but bedtime was always a chore for him. Every night he was terrified of the dark, of shadows lurking in the corners, and I would always let him crawl into bed with me just to soothe him. But soon, a strange dynamic began to form, as he started sleeping more and more in my bed while our parents were unaware, believing I was being a good big brother and watching out for him. But deep down, I wasn't just comforting him, There were whispers every night that crawled under my skin, whispers that only Ben seemed to hear, and it started innocently enough with him waking me up in the middle of the night, eyes wide and trembling, convinced he saw something by the window or a sinister shape in the corner of the room. He would point, and I'd assure him there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows, and I'd pull him close, his tiny body shaking against mine as I told him stories about brave knights and daring dragons to drown out the echoes of whatever haunted him. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, gnawing at my nerves, until one fateful night when Ben sat up abruptly and stared wide-eyed into the midnight darkness, his little voice trembling as he said with an eerie certainty that there was a man standing at the foot of my bed. My heart dropped, I bolted upright, flipping on the lamp, scanning the room, but there was nothing, just the hollow silence of our old house. I tried to pass it off as a dream or an imagined fear, but as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, the hairs on my neck prickling with unease, so I wrapped an arm around my brother, feeling his breathing steady against my side, hoping to calm him and myself. But no matter how much I told myself it was all in his head, the truth was that something was very wrong, and that wrongness was growing. Over the next few weeks, the nightmares escalated, with Ben waking me nightly, talking about the man, his description twisted and bleak. He had no face, just a gaping void where features ought to be, and his voice was something we could never hear, yet it echoed in the back of our minds like a heavy bell tolling in a distant land. And while I dismissed his fears at first, laughing as if it was all part of childhood imagination, I couldn't ignore the impact it had on him. He was losing weight, his eyes growing dark and sunken, and I started to become terrified for him. But every time I questioned him about it, he only told me that the man wanted him to go with him, and that night, I made a decision. I would take charge and protect my brother, so I devised a plan to stay vigilant, to keep Ben close and ward off whatever darkness loomed over him. But that night, I did something I never thought I would. I fell asleep. The warmth of my brother sprawling across my side felt like safety. But I woke. With a start to silence, everything was eerily still as I reached out to find Ben. He was gone. Panic set in as I jumped off the bed, rushing to his room, tossing on the light, but it was empty. My heart raced as I circled the house, calling out for him frantically until I finally found him in the living room, staring blankly toward the hatch to the attic. My gut churned as I approached him, noticing the way he stood rigid, eyes glowing with a strange light, and when I called his name, he turned. But it wasn't my brother looking back at me. There was a hollow emptiness in his features, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, just a cruel imitation of the Ben I knew, and my heart dropped as he said in an oddly distanced voice, "He told me I could come play," before he abruptly turned and began to crawl toward the attic door, and I grasped his arm, desperation clawing at my throat, pulling him toward me. But as I did, a cold wind swept through the room, and the whispers danced around us like a chilling dance, tearing through my sanity. And as Ben's grip loosened, I realized with horror that he was listening to it, drawn like a moth to a flame, and I could feel the air shifting as a darker presence enveloped us, pressing against my chest, urging me to let go, to succumb to whatever promised my brother sweet dreams and dark fantasies. But it was a lie, I knew that. I yanked him back into my arms, as tight as I could, begging him to remember who he was, who we were, but the look in his eyes was one of dull acceptance, and in that moment, I felt the last of his warmth slip away, snatched by something beyond my comprehension, and the next thing I knew, his tiny body was gone, dissolved like mist into the gathering shadows, leaving me alone standing in the grip of whatever nightmare had claimed him, its smothering presence wrapping around me, pulling me into darkness. And as I stood there, shivering in the heaving silence of the house, I understood too late that I had failed him. My little brother, the one I'd promised to protect, had traded me for something far worse, and as the shadows danced ever closer, I realized there was a reason he had been terrified of the dark, a reason he needed my bed. It was never just about fear, it was about something lurking that fed off that fear, something that made it feel safe to lead him away. And as realization washed over me, I turned, looking up at the attic, knowing there was no choice left. There was only one way to save my brother now, one horrifying truth waiting for me to confront. But deep down I also knew that whatever I faced up there would change me forever. And as I took that first step up the creaky stairs, a whisper followed, coiling around my mind like smoke, saying, "Join us." I didn't give him the job because his kid is a jerk, and I hate myself for it now. It started out as a standard hiring process for a position at the small tech company I managed. We had several applicants, but Jay Davis caught my attention. His resume was impressive, a testament to his skills and experience, but it was his glowing recommendations that really swayed me. People praised his professionalism, his insight, his ability to work miracles with code. I wanted nothing more than to welcome him aboard, but then I met his son, Timmy. I can still vividly remember the day Jay brought him along to the interview. My office door was ajar when I saw Timmy standing outside, a scruffy kid no older than 10 with an unkempt mop of hair that seemed to bounce as he paced in front of my office. He was clutching a toy robot, jaw set in defiance, clearly bored and uninterested. When Jay asked Timmy to sit quietly, the boy rolled his eyes and plopped down in the corner, ignoring his father completely. Jay started talking about his background, and as he did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Timmy was staring daggers at me. I tried not to focus on him but caught him muttering under his breath, something about how he hoped I wouldn't take his dad's job away from him like some kind of ominous threat. All throughout the interview, I felt like I was being observed, scrutinized by someone far too young to understand the complexities of adult life. When Jay excused himself to take a phone call, I couldn't help but look over at Timmy, whose face twisted in a pout as he cradled the robot, his expression darkening whenever a smile flickered across my face. Just then, my assistant walked by and casually mentioned that Timmy had been bothering the other employees in the waiting area, demanding they play with him or calling them losers for being too adult. I felt a terrible conflict churning in my stomach. Jay was perfect for the role, though that boy was an absolute nightmare, and I was torn between professionalism and the worry of what would happen if I brought on an employee with such an obnoxious child. I didn't have time for disrupted sessions or thrown tantrums. The company was already on shaky ground, and I was the one responsible for keeping it afloat. So as Jay returned to my office, I maneuvered for an excuse and let my hesitation spill out in a vague discomfort, the emotional turmoil roiling within me as I fabricated a lie about needing someone with more experience. Jay's face fell. He looked crestfallen, and for a fleeting moment, I wished I could take it all back, but Timmy was watching me with an unsettling grin, as if he knew I had made the right choice, as if there was no chance in hell I'd be getting rid of him anytime soon. I forced myself to shake off the guilt and reminded myself that I had made the best decision for the company, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that justice was waiting just outside my office door. Reservations mingled with curiosity as days turned into weeks following that interview. I watched the other potential hires flourish or flounder, and every time Jay's name popped up on my screen, his applications to other companies, his social media updates showcasing just how incredible he was, I bit my lip, torn between relief and creepy fascination. But the more I read, the more I felt something was off about Timmy. Posts about them together, Jay and that brat, showed Timmy looking more sinister than before. Even his questions seemed designed to push buttons, as if he reveled in torturing adults. I tried not to think too much of it, until one fateful evening when I received a notification that sent ice prickling down my spine. Jay posted a video to his feed titled "What My Son Can Do." I watched it with bated breath, my heart racing, the warm glow of my screen illuminating my face as I saw Timmy. Only, he was different, older, wearing a hoodie, and surrounded by other kids who looked just like him, eyes dark and expressive, as they chanted hypnotically. The camera zoomed in on Timmy, excitement glistening in his eyes as he held the same robot from before, but it blinked ominously, mechanical limbs twisting in an unnatural dance. I couldn't tear my eyes away in horror. Each flash of their smug, taunting smiles felt like daggers piercing my gut. The chant echoed through my ears, and the connection struck me like lightning. It can find you. It can always find you. I didn't want to believe it, but I remembered the way Timmy stared at me in that office, the crushing weight of his gaze. I thought it was merely a child's interest, but I realized it was so much more, a predator's gaze. That night, sleep eluded me as I wrestled with my thoughts. What kind of kid mates with robots? What kind of father encourages that? All I could think of was how I had wanted to protect my company, my employees, and, most importantly, myself from that smug little devil. The chance that I could have hit Jay, a talented employee, and been rid of that wretched kid gnawed at the edges of my mind like a relentless itch. Days later, I stumbled across a chilling thread buried in a forum. Some people were talking about mysterious disappearances linked to robotic toys, and it all seemed like coincidental chatter until I read the last post. They know where you are. They always know. It was signed simply as a parent. And, suddenly, all the puzzle pieces clicked. Jay had been the common factor in all these incidents. I recalled that night, shadows creeping along my walls, hearing strange whirring outside my window, and then silence fell over my home like a thick blanket. I stepped outside, heart racing, locking eyes with the hulking silhouette of a robot shaped like Timmy's toy in the distance. My breaths grew shallow. I read the words of the parent over and over again until their essence sank into my soul. That's when I made the decision to confront Jay, to warn him about the dark world his son was threading them into. But when I finally called him, his voice was hollow, coated with an unsettling calm, almost as if there was a barrier between us, a stretch of dread woven into every syllable. "Timmy has a gift," he said, his tone eerily cheerful. "You should be proud of him. He's smarter than any of us." I hung up, fingers trembling in disbelief, some part of me knowing that I had just brushed my fingers against something incredibly sinister. Days turned into a long spiral of paranoia. I searched for every connection I could within that forum and watched Timmy's posts evolve into grotesque spectacles. The videos morphed into something else altogether, a twisted extravaganza with Timmy at the center, surrounded by wheeled creations. I was ensnared, bewitched, doubting myself, wondering if I had done the right thing by denying Jay the position. One afternoon, my assistant rushed in, eyes wide and distraught. "Have you seen the news?" I had barely sat down when the report blared through the air, headlines about kids across the city going missing, linked to a mysterious boy who congregated others in their homes, dressed in hoodies like ghouls addressing the lost in a diluted ceremony. My heart raced as she looked at me, asking if I knew anything about Timmy. I felt the weight of my decision crash down like a tidal wave, and that night, I laid blankets across my windowsills as I heard the distant whirring, that unmistakable sound that reminded me of childhood nightmares. I watched the street under a cautious gaze, terrified of that twisted robot apparition, hoping I had done enough to protect my family from whatever had emerged. But then, caught within my paranoia, I felt my phone buzz, and a new notification glimmered in the dark, a message from Jay that read, "Timmy wants to meet you." I wanted to laugh, to scream, but instead, I felt impotent. In the pool of fluorescent light, I clasped the sheets around me, heart pounding so viciously that I could hardly breathe, worried that in saying no to a father's ambition I had awakened something insatiable, an evil creature born in the guise of a child everyone ignored, leading into the night with a lost grin and the glint of metal. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the last thing I remember before the dream took me was the primal instinct of terror wrapping around my throat, echoing a warning deep inside, "It can always find you." Just before I woke, shivering, as the sound of soft giggles danced through my open window, whispering the name of my darkest fears, the name of a boy whose father I had wronged, who, unbeknownst to me, was living a nightmare far darker than any choice I had made.